Hello friends, welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda, an ongoing series examining, well, the dungeon design in Zelda. I'm so glad to be back at it again and starting a new game. That's right, we're jumping into Breath of the Wild. There's a touch of irony to be had here jumping into Breath of the Wild with a critical eye. I haven't exactly kept it a secret that Breath of the Wild is to date my favorite game ever. I also haven't kept my fascination and love for the dungeons of the Zelda series a secret either. For me, it's one of the best parts of almost every Zelda game. I love the feeling of unraveling these places, like picking apart a tangled knot. So how is it then that me, someone who loves dungeons so much, holds Breath of the Wild in such high regard when it falls so short in the dungeon category? Well, I guess it just does everything outside of those dungeons so well that I can't help but love it despite those shortcomings. Or maybe it stems from me being a contrary piece of work that just doesn't like being told what to do. A game where I don't have to listen to anybody's directions and just do what I want to do is kind of appealing. No, really though, the world design outside of the dungeons in this game is superb, the best in the series in my opinion, and that idea of free exploration, of openness and non-linearity influences every aspect of this game's design, including that design within the dungeons, to the point that some people don't even count these as dungeons because of just how radically different it all feels from past games. And sure, that's a valid standpoint to take, but not a sentiment that I necessarily share 100%. I don't personally view the shrines as dungeons, so much as they are stand-ins for finding heart pieces in the overworld, while also doubling as fast travel points. The actual dungeon tropes, such as getting a map, rewarding us with a full heart container after a boss fight, and granting us a new item, or in this game's case, the champion abilities, all of that, it's all here in the Divine Beasts. But we'll get into that soon. As usual, let's just start with a quick overview of some pre-dungeon stuff that we need to do. Let's hop into it. Now, this being Breath of the Wild, you might think that aside from the Great Plateau, that there isn't anything mandatory that you actually have to do before any of the Divine Beasts, right? I mean, technically the Divine Beasts themselves aren't even mandatory. You could skip them and go straight to Ganon if you wanted. But if you are choosing to challenge the Divine Beasts, the game does make you do some questing beforehand. You can't just paraglide over to the Divine Beast's back and board it. That's been tried. Doesn't work. Of course, there is also a plethora of optional stuff you can choose to or not to do, such as going to Kakariko Village to talk to Impa, getting the Champion's Tunic, upgrading the runes at the Hateno Ancient Tech Lab, and tons of side quests. I personally decided to go get the Master Sword before doing any of the Divine Beasts, because I just love having it and being able to throw sword beams around. And then I also figured that while I'm here, I might as well do Trial of the Sword while I'm at it. Of course, that means completing at least 40 shrines to ensure that you have enough hearts to extract the blade in the first place. And if I'm doing those 40 shrines, I might as well collect a bunch of Korok seeds along the way and expand my inventory, right? And if I'm doing that, I might as well get a good horse too, which means that I need to get the ancient horse gear, and see, this is what happens when I play this game. I get so easily sidetracked. My sessions playing this game are just a series of me saying, oh, just one more thing before I do that. Oh, just one more thing before I do that. Over and over again before I do anything of actual story significance. But that's also what I love about the game. People have complained about the world being too empty or what have you, but I love just how much stuff there is to do everywhere you go. I adore that sense of exploration. I Love this world. Another bit of freedom this game offers is that unlike previous games that we've examined, there is no set dungeon order. You can complete the divine beasts in any order you'd like, or choose to skip them entirely. But Vah Ruta, in particular, feels to me like the intended first dungeon. The game sends you in this general direction early on by suggesting you visit Kakariko Village. From Kakariko, you have a great view of the Lanayru wetlands, where you might decide to go visit this shrine or the nearby tower. But scattered all around this area are a bunch of Zoras who will accost you and ask you to go see Prince Sidon at Inogo Bridge, which is right beside the Lanayru Tower. Basically, there is this entire area of the map that funnels you towards this divine beast, which is not the case for the other three. Maybe that's because the other three are more openly visible in the overworld and therefore easier to find, but it really feels like the world design is pushing you towards this one first. And in fairness, it is a good starting place since it's probably the simplest divine beast, and Mipha's Grace is more useful in the early game than it is later when you're loaded up on hearts. Once you meet Sidon, he'll ask you to head towards Zora's domain, though you can actually skip this and there is alternative dialogue if you don't meet him here first. The path to Zora's domain is under constant rainfall thanks to the divine beast, which is spewing an unending flow of water into the air. At Zora's domain, King Dorephan will explain that this heavy rainfall threatens to destroy the dam at their water reservoir, and asks for your help appeasing the divine beast. He gives you the Zora armor, which will also be required since it allows you to swim up waterfalls. After a quick discussion with Muzu, the racist Zora, Sidon will ask you to prepare yourself with at least 20 shock arrows, and Muzu will advise that you can load up on them up on Polymus Mountain, where a Lynel has made its home, and has a stock of them. If you have enough of them already, then you can skip this, but otherwise it is actually a good way to load up on plenty of shock arrows. You can also find the other matching pieces of the Zora armor set by showing this lady a photo of a red Lynel, and by finding this chest in Toto Lake. You know, if you want the whole set, that is. Once you're all prepared, you and Sidon can take the attack to the divine beast. You can ride on his back while he swims around the reservoir lake, use Cryonis to destroy the ice that the divine beast launches at you, then swim these waterfalls and shoot the orbs on the divine beast's back with shock arrows. Slight confession here, but I personally love these attack on the divine beast sections. They're really exciting, and the idea of having to work together with another character and fight your way inside this giant machine is very different from what we've seen in the past, which often has just come down to stumbling upon a dungeon entrance somewhere. This sequence in particular somewhat calls to mind for me the chase towards the sand ship in Skyward Sword, which I also loved. Sadly though, this scenario is short-lived. It only takes 4 successful shots with shock arrows to stun Vah Ruta, and personally, I would have loved to have seen this sequence expanded upon even further. Sure, Ruta will also launch these ice attacks at you, but I personally never found this to be much of a threat, since you can very easily use Cryonis to counteract this. But alas, once all 4 orbs are zapped, the divine beast will be stunned, allowing you to board it and head inside.
Show the enemy no fear. I'll see you back at Zora's domain. Farewell.
Welcome to Divine Beast Vah Ruta, named after Ruto, the Zora water sage and princess from Ocarina of Time. As far as dungeon theming goes, this is essentially a water-themed dungeon, minus the swimming, set over the backdrop of the rather ubiquitous ancient Sheikah architecture. As far as Vah Ruta itself goes, this one feels incredibly rudimentary in my opinion, which is a touch ironic, since water-themed dungeons have been notorious in past games for their difficulty. The puzzles all feel very straightforward, and there's just a general lack of enemies. Not counting the boss, there's literally only 3 enemies in the entire dungeon, all of them being guardian scouts. That number goes up to 10 if you count the malice eyeballs, and then 11 if you count the boss. 11 enemies, including the boss. That is an absurd lack of combat in a main dungeon. Previous games have had individual rooms with more enemies than that. Even the entry room of the Deku Tree, the most tutorial dungeon of all tutorial dungeons, nearly matches this total number in this one room. This is made even worse by the fact that those 7 malice eyeballs, which make up 70% of the enemies here, can be killed in a single hit. Considering the threat that the divine beasts represent, I just feel like I should be in more danger while I'm in here. This should be the sort of undertaking that I need to rigorously prepare for, but sadly this is one of the easiest areas of the game in my opinion. Heck, sauntering through central Hyrule is more dangerous than this place. This enemy presence isn't even increased in master mode. I'm not asking for Hyrule warriors here, that would be overkill, but this divine beast, really all 4 of the divine beasts, feels strangely devoid of any enemy presence. I could forgive this lack of danger if the puzzle element was stronger here, but as I mentioned before, the puzzles here are all very rudimentary. Because of the open layout of the divine beast, there is also almost no navigational challenge. There are no keys or locked doors even, unless you count this gate that you open with Cryonis. The main puzzle mechanic instead stems from the ability to control the trunk of the divine beast itself. By moving the trunk, a spray of water can be directed to various points of the dungeon which, depending on where it lands, can have varying effects on the mechanisms within. For example, turning these large water wheels in either direction. Despite the lack of navigational challenge and the simplicity of the puzzles, I actually really do like this gimmick. Being able to control this freely at any time, riding these rotating water wheels, and being able to traverse the dungeon is actually pretty fun despite those aforementioned issues. I like the idea of manipulating the dungeon itself in such a flexible way, and in a way that is meaningful to the progression. I also think this dungeon uses its verticality really nicely. The dungeon has 3 main interior floors, the trunk, which can extend upwards, and the roof. And because of the way they're stacked within the structure, with this largely open concept allowing you to glide between floors, the dungeon has a very cohesive layout. It feels like it all makes physical sense. Nothing against the dungeon layouts of previous games, of course. I love those winding, twisting labyrinths, but I also have to admit that often outside of a central room, the areas of many previous dungeons have felt disjointed in a way that you just don't get here. That idea is a bit of a double-edged sword, however. It is great that this all makes physical sense within this space, and that the entire dungeon is basically loaded into one area at once and is freely traversable. But the downside to this is that this limits the scope of the dungeon. They've somewhat trapped themselves in a box by doing this. From the outside, these divine beasts look massive, and they are, but compared to previous mainline Zelda dungeons, they're actually very small in scope. A dungeon with 3 floors, 4 if you count the roof, does sound huge, but when each floor is basically a single room, or worse, just a component of a single room, it becomes very clear that this just doesn't compare to the massive multi-room structures of previous games. Compare this map I made of Vah Ruta to, say, the map of the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, or even better yet, the Water Temple, and it's simply no contest. In terms of architecture, there isn't too much to say here. Vah Ruta is an ancient Sheikah construct, using the same swirling patterns and designs as the shrines. These are actually based off of real-life Japanese Jomon pottery. This inspiration is made all the more clear if you look at a Jomon urn, turn it upside down, and compare it to the Guardians. It's clear as day. Taken on its own, I actually really love this architectural style. I think it really stands out and is totally different from anything else in the series. That said, within the context of this game itself, and I know this isn't exactly an unpopular opinion, but because it gets so overused throughout the game, it does feel somewhat lacking in variety. I will say that they do stand out a bit from the shrines, which remained untouched by the calamity, hidden safely underground with nothing but artificial lighting, while the divine beasts wander outside under the sunlight, glowing with malice in their corrupted states. But even then, that just means that the lighting's a little different, and some spots are pinkish red instead of blue and orange. It is hardly a departure when compared to how varied and different the dungeons of the previous games were. Vah Ruta is modeled in this style after an elephant. This seems like a strange choice to me personally, as the only instance I can think of there being any likeness of an elephant in this series is the statues in Link's Awakening. Even then, that was in a deity's dream world, not Hyrule. The book Creating a Champion shows that there are cut concepts for other water-themed divine beasts, so there must have been a reason they scrapped these more conventional ideas and landed on a giant elephant, a creature with no significance to the Kingdom of Hyrule. What that reason is still a little beyond me. But maybe of all these ideas, the elephant is the one that made the most sense from a level design standpoint, since there's no underwater swimming in this game. The game is also far more explicit about presenting the history of its dungeons, compared to previous games where ancient ruins just seem to be here without any explanation. 10,000 years before the Great Calamity, the technologically advanced Sheikah built the 4 divine beasts and the Guardians as an overpowered army in order to subdue Ganon. While the Guardians are autonomous, the divine beasts require a pilot with whom they could form a spiritual bond. In preparation for Ganon's prophesied return 100 years ago, the Kingdom of Hyrule excavated these divine beasts and planned to use them against Ganon just like their ancestors did. Vah Ruta in particular was excavated somewhere near Zora's domain, though if I had to guess where exactly, it would be this quarry area just to the north of Zora's domain, Ulria's Grotto. What the Kingdom of Hyrule didn't account for was their adversary being so cunning. Ganon learned from his past defeat and had a strategy of his own, turning the weapons found to use against him into his own personal army. When Ganon returned 100 years ago, Mipha rushed to her divine beast, only to find an agent, an extension of Ganon's power inside, killing her and taking control of the giant machine. Okay, let's talk about the music for a moment. Many people critique Breath of the Wild's soundtrack for being uninteresting or too toned down, but I personally really love it. The quieter moments of the game make the sparse but deliberate use of music stand out all the more. As far as the music of Vah Ruta goes, I think it's fantastic. There is an incredibly palpable sense of sadness in this track. It's predominantly piano with what sounds like grinding machinery in the background, making for this tragic ambience. The music also builds upon itself as you make progress, with more layers being added in the more terminals you've activated, and that tragic feeling only gets more and more amplified. Once all the terminals are activated and you have to make your way to the boss, the theme shifts into a faster-paced theme with this dark sense of urgency. It's worth noting that this part of the song is the only time a percussion layer is present here. also well documented now that the 4 divine beasts have a Morse code SOS signal underlying their themes. Combine this with the piano chords, the context of this being the place where Mipha met her end, and you've got a powerful, emotional piece of music here. This song to me feels like an expression of Mipha's grief. The SOS code, her cry for help, since now her spirit is trapped. The machine she was destined to pilot proudly, now acting as her prison. She, along with the other champions, failed to protect Hyrule from the calamity. She met her end without being able to say her goodbyes to her father and brother, for whom she cared for quite a lot. And she failed to protect Link after vowing to always be there to heal him. This isn't her fault, but I have no doubt that Mipha as a character carries a lot of grief with her in the afterlife as a spirit, and that grief and powerlessness is captured incredibly well within this song. Alright, let's review the progression in detail. We'll enter the Divine Beast from this side boarding platform. Up this ramp, we'll find the first floor central room. From here, there's a ramp down to the central control unit, but we can't do anything with that just yet. So instead, we'll need to start by following Mipha's instructions to download the map from the guidance stone here. The gate blocking it can easily be lifted using Cryonis. Once the map is downloaded, our objective is to activate 5 terminals spread out around the Divine Beast. As I mentioned before, you can actually do these in any order you'd like, but I'll cover them in the order that I find to be the most logical and natural in terms of when and how you'd come across them. The first one is right here in this central room. You just need to use Magnesis to turn this crank and raise this platform with the terminal. Easy. There's a ramp to head upstairs along the outside of the Divine Beast, taking us to the second floor. The second terminal can be found here inside the smaller of these 2 water wheels. Simply use Cryonis to halt the water flow that turns the wheel, step in, and activate the terminal. There's another ramp over to the center of the larger water wheel, which houses the third terminal. To open the gate, this orb has to be in this slot, so you'll need to time your use of stasis to keep it in there. From here, the only way to make progress is to ride along the water wheel itself and onto this ledge. Once you've made it up here, there is a switch that activates a waterfall, creating a shortcut back up. You can follow this hallway from here out to the Divine Beast's trunk, where you'll find the next terminal. The easiest way to reach it is to manipulate the trunk and paraglide over, then move the trunk back to its upright position so that you can activate the terminal. This should also give us a good jumping off point to reach the roof of the structure. The final terminal is found here in this very top room. The terminal itself is surrounded by flames, so we'll need to use this crank to open the hatch in the ceiling. The sunroof, if you'd like. This will allow us to now move the trunk into position to douse the flames, granting us access to the terminal. Just as a side note, there's a handful of optional treasure chests we can find to nab some goodies as well, including this one on the roof, one in the water at the bottom floor, this one on a ledge, and this tricky one inside the larger water wheel, which requires some tricky timing with stasis to get. Aside from that, the only thing left to do is activate the central control unit, which leads us to the boss fight. While attempting to activate the central control unit, Ganon's malice will manifest here as Water Blight Ganon. This is the extension of Ganon's spirit that killed Mipha and took control of the Divine Beast a century ago, and now it's up to us to put an end to it. If only it weren't so easy. Alright, visually speaking, I actually kind of like the blights. Sure, it gets redundant, but they seriously look like horribly spliced together nightmares. That said, I also do wish there was more variety in boss designs here, but taken on their own merits, they aren't too bad. This is also a clean break from previous titles, as the boss doesn't have as defined a pattern or method of defeat. Since there isn't a unique dungeon item before the boss fight, Link's base weapon set and rune abilities are all that's required to defeat him. Water Blight Ganon in particular uses Cryonis and wields a lengthy spear as a weapon. This ability to use Cryonis presumably was absorbed from the Divine Beast itself. His long range is going to be the biggest challenge during the first phase of this battle. Any attacks that you have at your disposal should be enough to get through this. But if you're skilled enough with dodges and flurry rushes, then you should be able to slice through that first phase pretty quickly. There is of course a second phase to the battle. The arena will flood, forcing us onto these small platforms. With such a small amount of space to operate, this is going to be much more of a challenge. Using Cryonis both to create platforms and to counteract his own ice attacks is going to be essential here, especially because he floats up so high in the air that sometimes it's the easiest way to even reach him. You can also pull off some headshots with your bow to stun the Blight and open him up to attack. Flurry rushes sadly won't be of any use anymore due to the aforementioned water in this room, so stun him, get close, and deal some damage. Or use the Master Sword to just cheese the fight entirely. Your call. Just something worth mentioning, but I do kind of like that Water Blight mirrors Mipha in a way, with a mastery of water and both of their weapons being spears. Just a neat detail, though maybe a corrupted version of Mipha herself would have made for a cooler boss fight, sort of like the hollows that we saw in Age of Calamity. In fact, if we had gotten that, that would have been an almost heartbreaking scenario to have to play through. But overall, Water Blight Ganon is a pretty easy boss fight, but considering it's also the first one, or at least it seems like it's meant to be, I guess I can forgive that. Once defeated, we get our heart container, activate the central control unit for real this time, and Mipha's spirit will appear. After some quick dialogue, she'll reward us with Mipha's Grace, which is basically like being able to carry a fairy around with us at all times. Handy. The Divine Beast is now under the rightful control of its champion and can take its place in preparation for our impending duel with Calamity Ganon. So that's the dungeon. Overall, Vah Ruta works for me as a sort of introductory dungeon, but maybe it shouldn't be that. The issue is that this game has no set dungeon order. So this could be the very last one you do and end up being significantly easier than the others. That isn't a cohesive difficulty curve to follow, but more importantly, it takes a lot of effort to get to the Divine Beast, and then it all ends up being rather easy in the end. This shouldn't be an introductory dungeon because we already had the Great Plateau and its 4 shrines as a tutorial section, so the Divine Beast should be more challenging than that area. This brings me to an idea that I've had on my mind while comparing the Divine Beasts to classic Zelda dungeons: linearity versus straightforwardness. When critiquing games, I think there is this sort of misconception overall that linear is bad and non-linear is good, but I don't think there is anything inherently bad or good about either of those gameplay concepts. It all comes down to execution. There are very good linear games and very good non-linear games. There's also this idea of linearity being equal to easy or straightforward. But if looking at classic Zelda dungeons and now the Divine Beasts has solidified anything for me, it's that this is not the case. These Divine Beasts are non-linear, the most non-linear of any Zelda dungeon I've broken down to date, and yet they are among the easiest and most straightforward. Many classic Zelda dungeons are extremely linear, even if they don't seem to be. The Forest Temple doesn't seem linear with all of its branching paths, but there are hidden keys and locked doors preventing you from making progress outside of an intended sequence of events. In that way, even the most sprawling and open of classic Zelda dungeons are still linear in terms of their progression. The Divine Beasts give us an open floor plan and a general objective of activating 5 terminals, but you can activate them in any order you'd like, which makes them non-linear. Is one better than the other? Not in theory, no. It all comes down to execution, and in terms of that execution, I think there is some seriously untapped potential here. The Divine Beasts are an interesting experience, but for me, Vah Ruta falls short compared to the longer form dungeon experience that classic Zelda games have provided. Does this make it bad? No. but it does make them not as good. There is a distinction there. But where this divine beast excels is its atmosphere and flexible sense of traversal, scaling up to the very top of this massive mechanism and gliding down to the various floors and platforms feels awesome. It's really fun to do, and the overall vibe of this place is tragic in the best way. It's done really well. So mainly what my criticism comes down to is that I wish this were bigger, more challenging, and lasted longer. Overall, this video has probably lasted longer than it would take for most people to complete the Divine Beast. And as someone who loves the sense of exploration in Zelda dungeons, I just wish they'd gone bigger with it. Again, this doesn't mean it's bad, but it does feel like there's a lot of room for improvement. From as early as when you leave the Shrine of Resurrection, the divine beast Vah Rudania is visible, stomping around Death Mountain like he owns the place. And due to the shape of the mountain and Rudania's walk cycle, this divine beast can be seen at almost all times while out exploring Hyrule, so it's bound to catch the eye of most players early on, and draw them in out of curiosity. However, just as was the case with Vah Ruta, you can't simply climb right up to the divine beast and board it, though rather than a giant force field knocking you back, this time you'll simply burn alive. Great. So the game will make you do some questing before we can head inside. Before we get into that, it's worth getting the Flamebreaker armor set, which will allow us to withstand the extreme heat of the mountain. Elixirs work too, but you'll always be stuck with a time limit, so the armor set is worthwhile in my opinion, even if I don't care for the bulky design personally. You can buy the whole set from the shop in Goron City, but if you want to save a fair chunk of cash, the main torso piece can be traded for 10 fireproof lizards with this fella at the Southern Mine, which just so happens to be on the mountain trail anyways, so if you're approaching from the south, there's no real detour required. Just as a quick side note, because I can't help but talk about the music of Zelda, but the music of Death Mountain in Breath of the Wild is an interesting piece. It's actually a new version of the original Death Mountain theme from Zelda 1 on the NES. This is a much slower and less foreboding version, and the instrumentation here fits really nicely. I just thought that was a fascinating detail, because to my memory, this is the first time that track has been remixed in any way. We've seen the main Hyrule Field theme and even the Zelda 1 dungeon theme recreated fairly frequently, but as far as I can recall, never this one until now. So I appreciate them drawing their inspiration from the series roots like that. Anyhow, moving on. When we arrive in Goron City, we'll meet Bludo, the Goron chief, who hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. Bludo? He's a pretty burly old fellow, and he, along with a younger Goron named Yunobo, has been responsible as of late for keeping the divine beast Vah Rudania at bay, by essentially pummeling it with a cannon repeatedly. However, being the old-timer that he is, Bludo has been suffering from some severe back pain. No joke. He tells us that he had sent Yunobo to the abandoned North Mine to fetch some painkillers, but since Yunobo hasn't reported back, he asks that we go find him. The North Mine is just up the trail from Goron City and is infested with fire Lizalfos. We can use the cannons to defeat them or battle them head on, but long story short, we'll find Yunobo trapped behind this crag, which we can blow up with this cannon. He's a bit of an anxious fellow, but he'll suggest we head back to Goron City. He's headed there also to give Bludo those painkillers, and he assures us that there is likely to be some sort of reward for us, though that reward is simply some fireproof elixirs, but hey, that's fine. Unfortunately, the painkillers seem to not work, and since Bluto had sent Yunobo ahead once again in preparation for their next session of cannon blasting Rudania, he asked that we once again go find Yunobo, this time to cancel their plans. If you're feeling at all like an errand boy right now, don't worry, it's not as egregious as it sounds when actually playing through this section. We'll find Yunobo here at Elden Bridge. No, not that Elden Bridge. Yunobo here sure has a penchant for getting himself into trouble, however, as we'll find him being harassed by moblins. After fending them off and a quick chat, Link and Yunobo will decide to head up to the Divine Beast on their own. Since Link is able to operate the cannons and Yunobo is able to use Daruk's protection to act as a cannonball, the duo can beat the Divine Beast back into submission. We'll launch Yunobo in these cannons, first to lower the bridge, then at Rudania directly, all while making our way up the mountain and avoiding these sentries that the Divine Beast has deployed. I mentioned last time that I was very fond of these attack on the Divine Beast sections of this game, but among the four, this one is probably my least favorite. This isn't to say that I dislike it, but it feels far less action-packed than the others. Compare riding the waters around at high speed with Sidon, scaling these waterfalls and launching volleys of shock arrows down on Vah Ruta, to this slow climb up Death Mountain with Yunobo, which is one part cannon assault, one part stealth section, and one part escort mission. The pacing feels to me like a bit of a jumble of ideas, but at the same time, this also suits Yunobo's personality. He's not as self-assured and confident as Sidon is, nor does he have the same level of mobility, so a brazen assault like that doesn't make sense in the context of the story here. And I'm not saying that I hate it, I actually do sorta like this section, it just feels a little more drawn out and slow than the others. After enough hits with the cannon, Rudania will retreat into Death Mountain Crater. With the Divine Beast temporarily subdued, we'll finally be able to board it and head inside. Even though that means we totally just ditch Yunobo. Sorry, buddy. Welcome to Divine Beast, Vah Rudania. Named after Darunia, they just switched the letters around there, the Goron chief and fire sage from the era of the Hero of Time. Vah Rudania's theming takes an interesting turn from what you'd expect. At a glance, especially given the setting, it would be easy to simply say that this is a fire-themed dungeon and call it a day. But the absolute best part of this dungeon, in my opinion, is its use of darkness. As soon as you head inside, the doors and shutters will all seal, leaving you in nothing but pitch blackness, with only the light of these two blue torches and the pools of malice. The atmosphere here in these early moments is absolutely eerie and one of my favorite parts of any of this game's dungeons. The use of lighting, or the lack thereof, is chilling and fills this place with uncertainty in the best way possible. What's particularly neat about this, in my opinion, is the fact that these malice pools and evil glowing eyeballs are both your light sources and your obstacles, meaning that in order to make progress here initially, you have to destroy them, leaving yourself even more blind and vulnerable in the dark. You are able to find a torch early on and use it to light your way, but even then, the field of view stays extremely limited, and in order to do any combat, you're gonna have to either risk breaking it or put it away. That said, this dungeon does suffer from the same issues as Vah Ruta. There's almost no enemies in this dungeon, leaving that idea sort of underwhelming in the end. There's one Guardian Scout that you have to fight in the dark here between the entrance and the Guidance Stone, and that's it. Aside from that single scout, all the other enemies are malice eyeballs or the Stal enemy skulls that are spawned in by the pools of malice. I know I complained about this at length last time, but I'm gonna do it again. The atmosphere here is so eerie and creepy. It's absolutely brilliant, but you're not really in any danger here, which sort of undermines that atmosphere. I truly wish they'd done more with this concept. And of course, as soon as you obtain the map, the shutters and doors open, letting the light in here, and that amazing dark atmosphere is gone. What makes this and that lack of danger somewhat more forgivable for me is the strong puzzle focus of the rest of the Divine Beast. There are some very simple puzzles here, like with Ruta, but there are also a few that will actually put your brain to use in a way that the puzzles of Vah Ruta never did. This multi-room puzzle requiring us to transport a flame using that torch and then bring this orb back is a standout one in my opinion, and one that makes great use of this Divine Beast's manipulation gimmick. Vah Ruta allowed us to change the position of the trunk and direct this flow of water, but this time, rather than moving one part of this Divine Beast, we were able to change the position of the entire structure, which has a far more drastic effect. Essentially, we can have Rudania climb one of the inner walls of the crater or go back into its neutral position on the bottom, which rotates the entire dungeon between two positions at a 90-degree angle. The effect that this has on the traversal of this dungeon is huge. Because of this, even though the floor plan is actually smaller than Vah Ruta's, Rudania doesn't feel smaller because this entire section of walls becomes part of the floor plan. It's smaller, but it makes better use of its space, which makes that traversal more interesting to do. In a way, that better use of space incorporating the walls into the floor plan actually calls to mind for me the Goron mines from Twilight Princess. However, this is actually done even better here, because we're not limited to specifically curated magnetic sections on the walls. Plus, the iron boots in that game made walking on these magnetic walls slow and cumbersome. Here, we're not so restricted, and combined with the paraglider, our mobility in this dungeon is extremely flexible. It's great. Inside, this works well and is a great starting area to get comfortable with changing between these two positions. Then we're able to move to the dungeon exterior, which makes this traversal far more perilous, since you can fall right off the Divine Beast and into the volcanic crater below. So the dungeon manipulation here might be among the best in the game, since we're not just manipulating a single part of the dungeon, but rather the structure in its entirety. In a way, just turning the whole thing sideways is more conceptually simple than having this spray of water interact with various mechanisms, but that simplicity means that the designers had to make the puzzles more interesting, and that simple concept has greater utility throughout the dungeon's entirety, since it plays such a prevalent role in how we simply move about the place. Just like the rest of the Divine Beasts, Rudania is an ancient Sheikah construct, excavated from somewhere around Death Mountain. What makes this one interesting to me is that it feels far more like it leans into the beast part of Divine Beast. It is still clearly a giant machine, but unlike Ruta, there are no visible gears or moving mechanisms aside from things like doors and gates. Meanwhile, the interior ceiling of the Divine Beast's body has this vault design which almost looks like a spine and ribs, and of course there are the spines on the top, arched along the back of the beast's body. The design inspiration feels more organic here, despite being just as much a machine as the others. It also feels like a great callback to Dodongo's cavern from Ocarina of Time, which also featured these massive ribs along the ceiling. It's a great parallel, especially considering the Divine Beast's namesake. Rudania also seems to be modeled after a lizard. This is pure speculation, but in my mind, there are a couple of possibilities on what specific type of lizard may have served as the Sheikah's inspiration when designing this place. One is the fireproof lizard, which is native to Death Mountain and able to thrive in the extreme temperatures of its home. Though in my mind, the more interesting option is that Rudania was modeled after a Dodongo. These creatures have taken various forms over the course of the series, but the most similar one here is their more gecko-like appearance from Twilight Princess. Though not every feature of the creature is one-to-one, given how varied their appearances have been over the years, I think this is forgivable. Though perhaps it's even an amalgamation of the various appearances of Dodongos that makes the most sense here, with things like the spines on the back being pulled from their N64 design, while the legs and feet matching the look from Twilight Princess. Obviously, I have nothing to actually confirm this, creating a champion champion doesn't shed any light on the matter from an in-universe standpoint either. Interestingly, the tail is designed to be a large hammer, which is what Rudania uses to cause massive quakes and eruptions at Death Mountain. A hammer being used as a weapon, particularly the Megaton hammer, historically has had close ties to the Gorons. So between that, being named after a Goron chief, and the design parallels to Dodongo's cavern, it all sort of falls into place in my head, even if Dodongos themselves don't actually make any appearance in this game. Alright, as usual, let's examine the music here. Just like last time, the music of this divine beast will build upon itself the more progress that we make. During our initial moments inside, while shrouded in darkness, we have this eerie piece with crystal-like droning set over these dark, sinister piano chords. I mentioned last time as well that each of the Divine Beast's themes contain a hidden Morse code signal, which spells out SOS. Something I missed, however, and big thanks to Lord George 16 for pointing this out to me in the comments, is that there is actually a second opposing Morse code signal in these tracks. I had to go back and give them all a listen, and while it was a bit harder for me to pick it out of Vah Ruta's track, it kicks in right at the start of Vah Rudania's. The signal in question spells out SAD. While SOS is more well known to mean save our ship, or sometimes save our souls, being a clear call for help, I couldn't find a clear official source on the meaning for SAD. But since I'm assuming that the Divine Beasts don't have seasonal affliction disorder, and I sure would hope not at least, the more likely meaning is the one that most people online seem to be agreeing on. SAD standing for Search and Destroy. If we accept that the SOS is meant to represent the champions trapped inside the Divine Beasts and becoming victims to the blights that killed them and commandeered the vessels, then we can in turn infer that the SAD signal is the signal that Ganon is sending out either to the Divine Beasts or that the blights are commanding the Divine Beasts to do. These two Morse code signals are intrinsically intertwined, weaving in and out of each other, and even overlapping, musically representing the struggle for control of the Divine Beasts between the champions and Ganon's malice. It's a chilling bit of musical context, so thank you Lord George for bringing that to my attention. After we get the map and activate at least one terminal, the track picks up a bit, introducing some strings and woodwind instruments and a far more upbeat tone overall. While Ruta's theme stayed consistently heavy and tragic, Mipha's grief constantly at the forefront, Rudania instead starts out eerie and gets more optimistic the closer we get to our goals. The percussion layers kick in way sooner here too, with what sounds to me honestly like bongos and steel drums. Rather than urgency, these percussion layers add optimism. Once all terminals are activated, rather than piling on even more layers, the theme instead picks up in tempo, making the piece surprisingly energetic. I particularly adore what they do with the drums in this last section here. And if this all seems weird, especially compared to the somberness of Ruta's piece, I honestly think it makes a lot of sense considering the vastly different personalities of the champions here. Mipha described herself as being awash in a pool of tears and saying that she'd pretty much given up hope after her century of spiritual imprisonment. But when we show up here, Daruk stays casual and optimistic and even says that he never stopped believing that Link would show up. So the way the music picks up just feels right to me. Like those drums are Daruk cheering us on. There's so much going on here musically, it boggles my mind that people ever say that the music in this game is lackluster. Truly, this is good stuff. Okay, I think it's time we get into the progression here. We'll enter the Divine Beast from this boarding platform right at the base of the tail. And before anybody jokes about this being the butt, this is above the tail, so relax. Before we head inside, there is an optional treasure chest at the end of the tail directly behind us, you know, if you want it. Once we head inside, we're plunged into darkness. There's several malice eyeballs here which you can easily kill, and they'll actually each drop a treasure chest with some goodies. Most importantly among these is a torch, which you can use to carry around one of these blue flames. There is a locked gate here, but lighting the torch beside it with the blue flame will open it up. The next room has pretty much the same idea. More malice eyeballs and another gate requiring a blue flame to open. Behind this second gate is the guidance stone, so we can get ourselves the map. From here, we once again have the objective of activating 5 terminals around the Divine Beast. These can be done in any order, but I'll once again be covering them in the order that just makes the most sense to me logically in respects to how and where we encounter them. With the map obtained, the doors and shutters will also open, so we'll now be able to see and explore freely. The first and easiest terminal is right here outside the map room. Simply use the Divine Beast controls to rotate Rudania, and you can glide on over to this platform and activate it. The second one can be found by backtracking to the first section of the central room here. There's a large metal door that's barred shut and covered in overgrowth. This stuff can be burned away using a fire arrow or by throwing that torch, and then we can open the door up and activate the terminal. Just worth a mention, but there's been plenty of shrines leading up to this Divine Beast that have teased this idea to us, so it isn't a stretch by any means that the player would think to do this, in my opinion. Terminal number 3 is tucked at the very back end of the Divine Beast. There's a door here with a hole in it. We can ignite and shoot an arrow through the door to light a torch on the other side, which opens it. If you're out of arrows, don't worry. Those treasure chests I mentioned earlier have you covered. At least one should have a bundle of arrows, and there's 2 other chests that have bows. The terminal itself is behind a barrier of fire. If you haven't upgraded your Flamebreaker armor to get the set bonus, you can still get around this barrier by finding this metal block in the ceiling, blocking part of the flames, and rotating the beast. It's a decent little puzzle. The best puzzle here will take us to the 4th terminal. You may have noticed this orb slot in this side wall here. We need to bring the blue flame up this ramp to the Divine Beast's exterior. On the back is this torch, which when lit will actually release this orb into this shaft. By manipulating the Divine Beast's position, we can get this orb to go down the shaft, which follows inside the ramp we took up here. Lift this shutter and drop the orb into the slot, and a gate will open, granting us access to that terminal. The very last terminal is found on the top of the Divine Beast. It's tucked here under one of the spines on Rudania's back, and will be much easier to reach using some careful manipulation of the Divine Beast's position. With all 5 terminals activated, that just leaves the central control unit. This is almost right below that last terminal at the center of the Divine Beast's back, and as you'd expect, when we attempt to activate it, we'll be confronted by the dungeon boss. Flooding out from the main control unit, Ganon's malice will manifest again, this time as Fireblight Ganon, the scourge of Divine Beast Vah Rudania. This extension of Ganon's power is the creature that defeated Daruk and took control of the Divine Beast 100 years ago. Visually speaking, Fireblight is pretty imposing, continuing with the spliced nightmare of Malice and Sheikah technology design, but his overall size is comparable to even Daruk. Compared to Waterblight, he's a little less scrawny and creepy, and a little more large and intimidating, in my opinion. As far as bosses go, Fireblight has far more defined an attack pattern. So this time, it's not as much a matter of simply using any attack at your disposal, but rather you need to learn his pattern and figure out that method of breaking through his defenses, much more like classic Zelda bosses. The first phase of the battle is fairly straightforward though. Dodges and flurry rushes will help immensely here, as his sword swings pack a heavy punch. That said, said, he's not as evasive as Water Blight, meaning it's far easier to use your bow to hit stun him, ground him, and open him up to attack. There is, as usual, a second phase to the fight. This time, Fire Blight will use the power of Daruk's protection, possibly having stolen it from the Goron champion after their battle a century ago. He'll also use a lot of fire-based attacks, including infusing his weapon with flames, which gives his massive sword swings a larger area of effect. Sadly, because of his easily identifiable attack patterns, that means that during this second phase, he's far easier to take on. He'll deploy his shield and then suck in air to form a fireball, but in another callback to some other classic Zelda fire bosses, this leaves him vulnerable. You can toss a bomb at him while he's pulling in air and break his shield. You also are able to deflect these slow-moving fireballs with a parry, which will also break his defenses. Sadly, as cool as Fire Blight Ganon is, he suffers from the same lack of challenge as Water Blight, maybe even more so. It's kind of funny in a way actually, because I said Water Blight was too easy due to a lack of defined attack pattern, leaving him far too open to attack. Fire Blight, on the other side of things, has too easily defined an attack pattern, which makes his defenses easy to understand and break through. I mean, really, while I was recording footage for this fight, I was trying so hard to draw the battle out. Then, after defeating him, I reloaded my file to just before the battle and fought him again. This time, just battling him normally, and I was able to defeat him in 70 seconds. And that is counting the mid-battle cutscene between the two phases of the fight, which lasts about 15 seconds. So really, if we deduct that, I was able to defeat Fire Blight Ganon in 55 seconds. Less than a minute. Maybe I'm just very good at this game, so my opinion is a bit skewed here, but I just feel like a boss fight should be longer and more challenging, as a way to finish the dungeon with a bang, so to speak. That said, despite the lack of difficulty, I still find this fight to be really fun. The arena, being here on the rooftop, deep in the middle of Death Mountain Crater, with all of these classic Zelda callbacks, it's all very atmospheric, and I think having a bit more structure makes this battle fairly distinct compared to the last one. Of course, once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container, activate the central control unit, and Daruk's spirit will appear. After a bit of dialogue, he'll reward us with Daruk's protection, which acts as a force field, as well as a free parry if you mistime it, which is pretty nice. With the divine beast under the rightful control of its champion, Vah Rudania will take position at the top of Death Mountain, taking aim and waiting for its cue in preparation for our impending duel with Calamity Ganon. So, that's the dungeon. Overall, Vah Rudania is, in my opinion, a great step up from Vah Ruta. Its atmosphere, especially in those early moments, is incredible. I love the moments in this game when they plunge you into darkness like this. While this dungeon suffers even more so from a lack of enemy presence, the stronger puzzle focus and the absolute eeriness of this place kind of makes up for that in my opinion. I still wish there were more enemies, don't get me wrong, but when there's other engaging stuff to do in here, it is somewhat more forgivable in my opinion. Though this Divine Beast still has plenty of room for improvement as well. That dark, eerie atmosphere that I love so much at the start of the dungeon is very short-lived. I think I understand why. I believe they wanted to ensure that you can do the terminals in any order, and locking you in here in the dark would prevent that. But in my opinion, that rigid adherence to non-linearity held the dungeon back a bit. Had they run with the concept and locked us in, forcing us to solve more of these puzzles in the pitch dark, I think the dungeon would have been better for it, especially considering how many of these puzzles make use of these blue flames, which would have been visually incredible in the darkness. Heck, they could have made opening the doors and shutters the end goal or the reward for a puzzle, rather than it just happening on its own when you download the map. But alas, this isn't what we got. And even as I praise the stronger puzzle focus of this divine beast compared to Vah Ruta, it still pales in comparison to the strong puzzle focus of classic Zelda dungeons. It's a step up from the last one, sure, but still rather short and simple overall. And even then, this could be the first, second, third, or fourth divine beast because there's no set dungeon order. So even though I think it's an improvement over Vah Ruta, well, it might be a step down or a step up depending on what order you do these in. So to sum it up, if it were up to me, I would have added more enemies and kept the player in the dark for longer. But overall, Vah Rudania isn't bad. I still enjoy exploring this place, and the traversal here is really solid due to the way that we're able to manipulate the divine beast in its entirety, rather than just a single component of it. We also have a really fun boss battle at the end, which I always appreciate, even if it isn't too challenging. So mixed feelings. There's a lot of good stuff here, little glimmers of brilliance, but there is still plenty of room for improvement as well. As was the case with Vah Rudania, from even the earliest moments of the game, the divine beast Vah Medoh can be seen flying over the northwestern section of Hyrule, a massive, looming figure in the distance. I recall being absolutely fascinated by this before the game even came out during the E3 2016 demos. Seeing this huge flying machine out there was quite enticing. Since Medoh is so visible and out in the open, it isn't a stretch to say that it's likely to draw people in out of curiosity, which eventually will bring us to Rito Village. Now, it's worth a mention that out of the 4 divine beasts, Vah Medoh has the least amount of mandatory pre-dungeon stuff to do. But while we're here, it is worth buying the Snow Quill armor set from the shop here in order to provide better cold resistance. This is the only place in the game where you can get this set. That means no freebies like with the Flamebreaker armor, and it will be pretty much essential while exploring Hyrule's colder regions. Just a quick mention about the music, as usual. Rito Village's theme is incredible. It's a new rendition of the fan favorite Dragon Roost Island theme from Wind Waker. Rather than an upbeat, adventurous theme, this one is homey and melancholy. The way the track has this build up and then release before going into the Dragon Roost theme is just so evocative of that thoughtful, almost lonely feeling that is ever pervasive throughout this game. Honestly, I could go on and on about it, but really, above all else, it's just an amazing piece of music. It's calm, comforting, and just a touch morose all at once. And it's one of my favorite examples of this game's soundtrack taking old themes and putting a distinctly Breath of the Wild flavored spin on them. Here in Rito Village, we'll also meet Kennelly, the Rito chief, whose name is almost certainly a reference to Komali, the Rito prince from Wind Waker. Now, something worth a mention here is that according to Creating a Champion, the Rito are not very long-lived, implying that they have the shortest lifespans out of all the races in Hyrule. So while many Zora, including Sidon, were alive and well during the events of the Calamity 100 years ago, and recognize Link as, well, Link the Hylian champion, for the Rito tribe, it's possible several generations have passed since that event. No Rito alive has first-hand knowledge of the events from 100 years ago. As such, there's a bit of confusion here with Kennelly about Link's identity as a champion, and the Rito chieftain incorrectly deduces that Link here is merely a descendant of the Hylian champion. He'll ask that we help out with the divine beast, which the Rito warriors have been battling, To start with, we'll have to find Teba, a prominent warrior among the tribe, who is preparing to attack Vah Medoh alone. Teba's wife, Saki, will tell us that he took off to the flight range just outside the village. We can head over there and confront Teba. He'll understandably be skeptical when we tell him that we want to help him bring down Medoh, so he'll want to test us with a bit of archery practice. It's pretty simple though. You just have to shoot 5 targets within 3 minutes and you're done. Satisfied with your skill, he'll give you a handful of bomb arrows and give you a lift up so that we can take the fight to the divine beast. The attack on Vah Medoh is pretty straightforward and fairly similar to the attack on Vah Ruta in a lot of ways. Teba will give us a lift and will also catch us if we fall down too low. Medoh will raise a force field around itself and shoot lasers at us through these cannons, so we can paraglide over, shoot the cannons with bomb arrows, rinse, repeat. As I mentioned already, this is the shortest lead up to boarding any of the divine beasts. The actual attack on Vah Medoh is comparable to Ruta and Naboris, but there's very little questing or errands to be done beforehand. We don't have to gather ammunitions like we did with Vah Ruta. Teba will just hand over some bomb arrows and be like, okay, let's go, after watching us shoot some targets. I like this scenario. Flying high above Hyrule like this and performing aerial combat is awesome. It feels really good to do, but considering how much running around we have to do before boarding the other divine beasts, it feels like something is missing here, like some section of the quest was left on the cutting room floor. I can't say what that may have been, just that this feels abrupt. It would have been great to be able to spend more time with Teba than we do too. It doesn't feel like we get to know him anywhere near as well as we do Sidon, Riju, or Yonobo, but alas, maybe that also plays into Teba's personality. He was already preparing to go face Medoh on his own when we showed up, and he doesn't care about being Link's friend as long as Link can help him get the job done. That's my best guess at least. Anyway, once all those cannons are destroyed, the force field will disperse, allowing us to board the divine beast and head inside. Welcome to Divine Beast of Vah Medoh, named after Medli, the Rito Earth Sage from the era of the Great Sea. Medoh has a pretty distinct atmosphere. The beast remains afloat in the sky while we're exploring inside, and a fair amount of our traversal will be in exterior sections of the dungeon, giving this place a fairly grand sense of scope, as well as a perilous feeling since, you don't want to fall off. What's interesting is that Vah Medoh has a pretty expansive floor plan. This divine beast is enormous. The way it uses its space, however, is a bit of a mixed bag. For example, the second floor is this enormous space that takes up almost the entire rooftop, essentially making up Medoh's wingspan. It's huge, but it's also used only for this boss arena, so aside from these weird destructible pillars, it's pretty much just empty space. Inside, on the main floor, the rooms and puzzles are very densely packed together, and then there's these enormous gaps between rooms on the lowest floor. So even though the rooms are not huge, the feeling is larger because you have to glide through the open air. So we've got a bit of everything. Small isolated pockets separated by large open space, mid-sized rooms that are filled with the bulk of things to do, and then one huge open area that is pretty much empty space. Sounds weird, but for what Vah Medoh is, it actually kind of works for me. There's a good feeling of variety here in how the space is used. And if there is a sentiment that I've been repeating pretty often throughout this series of videos, it's that variety in level design is good. It keeps things interesting. Speaking of keeping things interesting, the dungeon manipulation gimmick this time around will allow us to tilt the divine beast at a 45-degree angle to either side. So much as was the case with Vah Rudania, even though the concept is less mechanically complicated, its conceptual simplicity allows for more versatility in how it's used. In terms of how we move about the place as well as integration into puzzles, this ability to tilt the structure structure in almost its entirety is really well implemented. More so than the previous two, this divine beast has a very strong puzzle box feeling to it, and that tilt mechanic is integrated into every single one of those puzzles. In a way, Vah Medoh actually strikes a healthy balance between Ruta and Rudania's approach to puzzles and traversal. Ruta's gimmick allowed us to move a spray of water to interact with a handful of mechanisms, such as these water wheels and flame pillars. Rudania had traversal and the change of floor plan from wall to floor as its main gimmick. Here, the tilting is worked into traversal the same as Rudania, but also has puzzles built around gravity and using these tilts to your advantage, much the same as how Ruta's puzzles were all built around directing that spray of water. So we have a mix here of those two design ideas, which is great to see. The traversal in Medoh is some of my favorite though, in terms of how flexible it is. There are various updrafts to use and open windows in certain areas, allowing you to approach things from different places. For example, this room, which you can glide to from the bottom floor of the central room, but can just as easily be reached by jumping out this window in the room above it and gliding down carefully. This dungeon lets you really think outside the box and approach things however you want. This is probably the best so far in terms of how they've tapped into the potential of this open air gameplay style while designing a dungeon. It's just very fun to explore this place. The big drawback though, and this should surprise nobody if you've been keeping up with this series, is the lack of enemy presence again. Just like with Rudania, there's a total of one single Guardian Scout. Otherwise, there's only Malice eyeballs and cursed style enemies, which can pretty well all be killed in a single strike. Why? The Malice is integrated into a lot of the puzzles here as it obstructs various paths, which is kind of cool. But then why not add in more of these scouts or some other enemies? This would have been an amazing opportunity to include some classic flying Zelda enemies like Peahats or aerial foes from Twilight Princess maybe? But alas, the story is the same here. One scout, a handful of eyeballs, and the boss, and that's it. As is the case with all the divine beasts, Vah Medoh is a giant Sheikah construct, this time modeled after a large bird of prey. Now, I'm no bird expert, so I wasn't really able to discern what specific type of bird, but I'd like to think it's an eagle for poetic justice, since Revali's weapon of choice is the Great Eagle Bow. That said, it could just as easily be a hawk or falcon or any other type of bird. The beak shape doesn't really match any birds of prey that I'm familiar with, but then again, I also don't know of any lizards that open their faces up the way that Vah Rudania does either, so I'm sure there were simply some creative liberties taken by the Sheikah architects. I mentioned last time that Rudania had the most organic feeling of the four, but Medoh comes in a close second. In fact, much like the puzzles and manipulation gimmick here, I find it something of a middle ground between Ruta and Rudania. Ruta feels far more mechanical, with giant gears and mechanisms. Rudania leans more into the organic feeling, with giant rib and spine designs built right into the ceiling. Medoh also has this same rib and spine-like design, but also has things like moving blocks, propellers and fans, and various other mechanisms present throughout. Nothing as hugely industrial feeling as those giant gears inside Ruta, but it's not absent like with Rudania either, so it falls somewhere in between. One of my favorite details is the windows on the bottom floor. The way they're designed, the window frames look like Medoh's rib cage, and I find it just very visually striking. Another visually memorable feature about this particular divine beast is the collection of destructible pillars on the top floor. As far as I can tell, these serve no real purpose, and it's always confused me as to why they put these here. All of the Sheikah shrines and divine beasts have been made out of this particularly durable stone that has stood the test of time for about 10,000 years without much sign of wear and tear, except for these pillars. This is probably a weird nitpick, but they've just always felt out of place to me. I'm guessing that the boss arena just felt too empty without something here to break up the monotony of this huge flat surface on the roof. But whenever I see these, all I can think about is how Medoh is essentially a flying machine, and these would not be particularly aerodynamic. But perhaps I'm just being needlessly nitpicky with this one. It's unclear where in Hyrule Vah Medoh was excavated, but if I had to guess, it would be somewhere somewhere in either the Hebra region or the Tabantha region. Around Lake Kilsey and Strock Lake seem like safe assumptions, but it could just as easily have been somewhere in the Tanagar Canyon, or pretty much anywhere else in the northwestern quadrant of Hyrule. It's hard to say, because there doesn't seem to be as clear a sign of any excavation operations around here, but they could have all fallen into disrepair or been buried by snow sometime over the last century. We simply don't know. The music of Vah Medoh is one of my favorites. Like the other divine beasts, it builds upon itself as we make progress. When we first enter, we have this slow, thoughtful piece that is mostly piano driven. The way those piano chords are hammered, sounding almost broken and off key, gives this place an immediately chilling, almost haunted sound. And of course, I can't neglect to mention the Morse code signals which are present in all the Divine Beasts themes. What's interesting about this one, however, is that it takes the longest to show up in Medoh's theme, but when it does, it's the most clear and obvious. The subtext here feels right at home knowing the personalities of the champions. It's no secret that Revali has a pretty great sense of pride, and one could view this delayed call for help as the Rito champion not wanting to admit defeat until it's too late. The opposing SAD signal, which I mentioned last time, also doesn't seem to overlap with the SOS nearly as much, making that cry for help stand out even more. This could represent Revali, who was a skilled warrior, holding out in battle, holding off the blight and its cry to search and destroy for longer than the other champions. Once we have the map and at least one terminal activated, the music kicks into gear with a persistent, rising string progression. The way the strings rise and fall like this just feels lofty, like a musical representation of the air circling these propellers and notes being carried in the wind. There's also a nice undertone of optimism in this track. It's not as bombastic as Rudania's, but it feels like the song goes from haunting to hopeful in a way. Maybe a musical parallel to the way Revali starts to come around on his feelings towards Link. Remember, this guy viewed himself as something of Link's rival, but by the end of our time here, he genuinely seems willing to make amends with the Hylian champion. Once all terminals are activated, the music evolves into this almost climactic piece. And I say almost climactic because it feels like this part is musically pushing you forward, but never quite paying off, evoking the feeling of anticipation before the boss fight. It's great stuff. Alright, let's go over the progression. The boarding platform where we make our entrance is here, once again above the tail of the Divine Beast. Before we head inside, there is, again, an optional treasure chest directly behind us on Vah Medoh's tail. We can then head inside, clear this malice, and we'll find ourselves in the central room. There's several movable blocks in here, which you can use to form a bridge, but you don't ever actually have to move them if you don't want to. You can just as easily hop across the gaps and reach the guidance stone on the other side. With the map acquired, we'll now be tasked with activating 5 terminals spread out throughout the Divine Beast. As usual, we can do these in any order, but I'll cover them in the order that feels the most logical to me in terms of how and where we'll find them. Before we move on, there's 3 optional chests in this central room here. One on this ledge, one on the bottom floor, and one at the top of this climbable wall. Since there's a locked door in the right wing that can only be opened from the other side, I prefer to start by heading into the left wing first. Terminal number 1 can be found in this alcove here. We can clear the malice, then tilt Vah Medoh, which should allow us to glide over to the alcove and activate the terminal. There's also another optional chest in here above this doorway. way. To get to the next terminal, there's a bit of a puzzle to do here. We'll find this funnel here that we can drop a bomb into. We'll need to tilt the divine beast so that the bomb rolls into the adjacent room on the other side of this barrier. Then detonate the bomb to destroy these rocks. Now we'll want to strike this gem switch to open one of the windows in said adjacent room. Roll another bomb through, and the wind blowing in should roll the bomb towards this destructible wall. Blow it up, and a metal sphere will be revealed. You'll probably have noticed a switch on the opposite wall here as well. We'll want to use the sphere to press it down. So line it up, tilt Medoh, and let gravity do the work for you. This switch now opens the gate, so we can head into that adjacent room and activate terminal number 2. Terminal number 3 is in a room directly below us. There's a number of ways to reach it, but I like to simply jump out this window and glide over to it. Easy peasy. That's 3 terminals done, and pretty much everything on the left half of the dungeon. The remaining 2 are over on the opposite wing, so let's paraglide back to the central area and head over. On the lower floor, you'll see a small gondola held in place by Malice. Destroy the eyeball to free up the gondola, and then by tilting the divine beast, we can bring it over to us. Then ride it over to the room below this wing. Head up the ramp inside, and we can activate terminal number 4. That aforementioned locked gate will now open, and we can do this little physics-based puzzle to reach the last terminal. We'll start by striking this gem switch and opening this window. There's 2 propeller switches, one is on this rail, a gate, a switch, and this heavy cylinder on this rail. Keeping both propeller switches moving in the wind will open the gate, allowing the cylinder to press down the switch. The tricky part is that tilting the divine beast to slide the cylinder over will also cause the second propeller to slide out of the wind, causing that gate to close and obstruct the cylinder. So you'll want to carefully hold it in place with magnesis. Sounds easy enough, but if the cylinder doesn't hit the switch with enough force, it won't press in. So don't be too surprised if you have to back things up and try it a couple of times. With that done, this gate should open and we can activate the last terminal. Just a quick side note, there's just a couple more optional treasure chests. One dropped by this Malice eyeball on the ceiling and another on this ledge right here. Most of the optional chests haven't been particularly useful in all honesty, but at least this one should give you a decent bow, which you'll want for the upcoming boss fight. All that's left now is the central control unit, which is on the rooftop here. And just as you'd expect, when we attempt to activate it, we'll be confronted by the dungeon boss. From the main control unit, Malice will flood out and form Windblight Ganon, the scourge that defeated Revali and commandeered Vah Medoh a century ago. Windblight continues with the same visual design as the other blights, having a horrible mix of Sheikah technology and malice, topped off with Ganon's head of flaming red hair. Though what separates Windblight from the previous 2 is that instead of an ancient sword or spear, Windblight opts for a giant arm cannon. This guy clearly took notes from either Samus or Mega Man or something. Much like the level design at large here, Windblight also feels like something of a middle ground between Water and Fireblight Ganon, minus the melee weapons. He's not as scrawny and creepy or as bulky and intimidating as either of them, falling somewhere in the middle. But he is still pretty big compared to little old Link here. The giant laser gun is pretty cool and all, but unfortunately, Windblight doesn't do too much that's interesting with it. He is able to launch tornadoes at you and obviously shoot lasers, but that's about it. He also doesn't do too much to shake things up when it comes time for the second phase of the battle either. Waterblight flooded the arena, reducing the amount of space within which you have to operate. Fireblight deployed his massive shield to increase his defenses. Windblight, on the other hand, releases these little ricochet drone thingies and bounces his laser between them. Unfortunately, it's very easy to avoid all of these attacks if you keep moving. Windblight may have a giant laser cannon, but he doesn't have the best aim. Heck, if you get close enough to him, he'll just aim right past you. Come on, Wind Boy, you're better than that. Windblight also spends a great deal of time flying up in the air, but there's a couple of these large fans allowing you to circumvent the only advantage that he has by floating up there and using bullet time to get in some headshots with your bow. In fact, that is really the crux of this fight. If you're good at landing headshots with your bow, then Windblight will go down very easily, and you'll spend more time waiting for him to finish teleporting around the arena than you will actually fighting him. Now, I'll say that my opinion on this matter might be somewhat skewed. I have live streamed this game a lot over the past few years, and I've been repeatedly told by viewers that I have very good aim. So if you're not as accurate with a bow, you might have a harder time here than I did. That said, I still feel like the ease at which you can get into bullet time and unleash a barrage of headshots undermines the difficulty of this fight, especially if you have that quick shot falcon bow that Teba gives you before your attack on the Divine Beast. That particular bow allows you to shoot farther, faster, and straighter than most other bows, meaning that even when he's keeping his distance from you, you're still able to land headshot after headshot and just drain his health. These little ricochet drone things are probably the most dangerous thing about this fight, since he'll unleash a heavy concentration of attacks and bounce them around. But even those can be destroyed with a well-placed arrow, so there's still not much risk here. To sum it up, Windblight just doesn't do much. He floats around, he wastes time teleporting excessively, which is more of a nuisance than anything, especially on Master Mode when his health will regenerate, but he's extremely open and vulnerable to attack, so you're able to just spam headshots and take him down. I really feel like this is the least interesting of the 4 Blight battles, which is too bad, because just looking at his design and that huge laser gun, I feel like there was some untapped potential here. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, activate the central control unit, and Revali's spirit will appear. After a bit of snarky dialogue, he'll reward us with Revali's Gale, which may be the most useful of the 4 champion abilities, since it allows us to ride an updraft into the air, which seriously bolsters our maneuverability, especially considering just how many mountains there are to climb around Hyrule. With the Divine Beast Vah Medoh under the control of its champion, it can take position above Rito Village, taking aim in preparation for our upcoming battle against Calamity Ganon. So that's the dungeon. Overall, Vah Medoh does a lot of cool stuff. It has a strong focus on physics-based puzzles as well as traversal. Our mobility in this dungeon is superbly flexible in the best way. I adore how the manipulation gimmick is integrated so well into both the puzzles and how we explore this place. It's fantastic. But oh boy, is there some room for improvement. I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, but the lack of enemy presence is very noticeable here. You fight that one Guardian Scout at the beginning, and then the whole place just feels so empty after that. This could have been a great place for flying enemies to show up, or enemies that push you back with either strong attacks or with wind-based attacks. Adding those would increase the risk of, well, falling right off the place. Just imagine this for a moment. In Wind Waker, when you're approaching the Forbidden Woods, we need to glide between these updrafts from one island to the next, all while these P-hats are gunning for you, so you have to carefully avoid them while navigating. Now imagine that while we're gliding along the wingspan of the Divine Beast. Rather than just a big empty space, we'd have some element of danger here. Between that lack of danger and how vulnerable Windblight Ganon is to attacks from your bow, it seriously makes me wonder how an archer as talented as Revali lost in battle here. Sorry, I know some people don't like this character, but you can't deny he is extremely proficient with his bow, which is the weapon that Windblight is most vulnerable to. Aside from that usual complaint though, Vah Medoh does somewhat make up for this with an even stronger puzzle focus than the last 2 dungeons, and a gimmick that feels more meaningful to our progression here. I do miss the combat, but I love exploring this place and solving these puzzles. It's fun just to move around in here. So it's a mixed bag, an underwhelming boss fight in nearly no enemies, but also some really fun stuff to do, and an awesome, lofty atmosphere. Overall, despite those criticisms, I really do enjoy my time exploring Vah Medoh. Vah Naboris has always felt to me like the most natural final dungeon out of these four, before Hyrule Castle of course. Aside from the difficulty curve, its placement on the map is not only the most isolated, but the least visible. Granted, Vah Ruta is also not very easy to spot at a distance before you complete it, but it has a lot to guide you in that direction, with King Rome sending you to Kakariko, and a bunch of Zoras spread out through the Lineru wetlands, all pointing you towards Sidon and ultimately to Vah Ruta. Naboris, on the other hand, is tucked way in Gerudo Desert, which is surrounded by the Gerudo Highlands. Most people will likely make their way over there by crossing through the Gerudo Canyon Pass, which winds between these mountain ranges. As usual, it's also not simply a matter of making it to the Divine Beast and boarding it, while hidden in the shroud of a sandstorm suspended atop its tall legs, and will launch bolts of electricity at any who attempt to approach it. Essentially, the game makes sure to not let you waltz right in. Instead, we'll need to make our way over to Gerudo Town, which is situated in the center of the desert. However, Gerudo law restricts men from entering the town, so first, you need to talk with these caravan people and get yourself a disguise from Vilya at the Kara Kara Bazaar. With the power of cross-dressing, we can now enter Gerudo Town and meet Riju, the Gerudo chief. Her and her bodyguard Buliara will see right through your disguise pretty easily, but Riju will also quickly piece together Link's identity as a champion. They enlist your help to bring down Naboris, but a test of your skill is in order first, which actually ends up being dual purpose. They ask for you to recover the Thunder Helm, a precious Gerudo relic that was recently stolen by the Yiga clan, who reside nearby in Karusa Valley. I won't dwell too much on this quest, but it's essentially meant to be a stealth mission where you sneak through their hideout. That said, you can also brute force your way through here by fighting all the Yiga Blade Masters. It's far more difficult to do since they can all one-shot you, but it is totally possible. In fact, I messed up sneaking around here while recording this footage and ended up doing it that way myself. At the end of this, we'll meet their leader, Master Koga, who ends up being something of a joke of a boss fight in the end. That always felt like something of a letdown to me personally, since the Yiga assassins and blade masters are all pretty cool, but their leader is a bit of a buffoon. Oh well. In some ways, the fight actually reminds me of the Zant fight from Twilight Princess, since it's kind of a bait and switch joke fight that ends up being really easy. Oh well. With the Thunder Helm recovered, Riju will ask you to meet up with her at the southern outpost, so that you can take the fight to the Divine Beast. Using sand seals, you can approach Naboris and launch volleys of bomb arrows at the beast's feet. If you're short on bomb arrows, don't worry, she'll give you a bunch right before this scenario. Riju will use the power of the recovered Thunder Helm to create a protective bubble, which blocks Naboris' lightning attacks. But I've always found that staying within said barrier is a little awkward, since Riju's movement speed is somewhere between your Sand Seal's normal and dash speeds, so you have to constantly speed up and slow down to stay within this safe zone. That said, the act of attacking Naboris, weaving between its legs at high speed and firing explosives, is something of a rush to do. It's a scenario I've always found to be exhilarating, albeit short-lived. The music here is a bop as well, which kind of helps matters. Just like the other Attack on the Divine Beast segments, I love this, but I wish it would simply last longer. Another note about this pre-dungeon questline, this sort of aids in why I feel this is an appropriate final Divine Beast. The quest leading up to this one and Vah Ruta both feel the most developed and thought out, making them stand out as decent first and last Divine Beasts. The lead-ups to both Rudania and Medoh especially, are much shorter and simpler overall, so bookending the Divine Beasts with these longer, more in-depth quests quests makes the most sense to me, since I think I've already made a good case for Ruta being the most logical starter dungeon. It then leaves Naboris, which is already the most difficult of the 4 anyways, as the last one. And like I said, that just makes the most sense to me personally, but of course there isn't actually a defined dungeon order, so you can complete them in whatever order you'd like. Makes sense, right? Moving on. With Naboris temporarily grounded, we can seize the moment and finally head into the dungeon.
Don't let us down, Link.
Welcome to Divine Beast Vah Naboris. Widely regarded as the most challenging of the 4 divine beasts, Naboris' name is derived from Niburu, the Gerudo Sage of Spirit from the era of the Hero of Time. While many people will say that this dungeon is the hardest of the 4, unlike some other notoriously challenging Zelda dungeons, I rarely hear people complain or say that Naboris is bad for this difficulty. In fact, I'd say that the level of challenge is pretty well balanced here. Maybe the best out of the 4. It also is what I feel to be the closest thing to classic Zelda dungeon design that Breath of the Wild has to offer. And I mean that in the best way. The overall progression is a lot less flexible and open air compared to Medoh and Rudania especially, but still offers a great balance of player choice while piling in tons of puzzles. And there are actual enemies. I mean, there are still only 6 Guardian Scouts, and otherwise it's just a bunch of Malice eyeballs, same as usual, but 6 is still a big step up. It's twice the amount that Ruta had. Meanwhile, Rudania and Medoh had only a single scout each. I'll take the win here. So yeah, this feels much better. And there's even a room where you have to battle 2 of them at once. It's still nowhere near what we get in classic Zelda dungeons, but the feeling of danger lurking around the corner of some actual threat is a lot more prevalent here. That's not even taking the boss fight into account, which is widely regarded as the hardest of the 4 blights, and I love it. Naboris, more than the other 3 divine beasts, feels like it actually wants to challenge you. Then there's the aforementioned puzzles. I called Medoh a puzzle box style dungeon, but Naboris actually packs in more puzzles than the other divine beasts, and they all revolve around a central core mechanic. The divine beast manipulation gimmick is at the center of all of this, allowing you to rotate these 3 massive cylinders within the central room. This changes the layout of the platforms in the room, of course, so traversing this central room is one puzzle in and of itself. But that is only scratching the surface. In the center of the room is a power source, and there are circuits connecting each cylinder that also extend outwards to other rooms in the dungeon. Completing these circuits activates various mechanisms throughout the divine beast, such as opening gates, having sections of the divine beast rotate continuously, and activating elevators, allowing you to gain more mobility and unlock more sections of the dungeon. This sort of progression structure tied to a core puzzle with mechanics rooted in a large central room is exactly the sort of thing you'd find in the best dungeons of classic Zelda games. And pairing this with Link's sheer mobility in this game makes for one hell of an enjoyable dungeon experience. This truly is the closest thing we get to a classic Zelda dungeon while still feeling distinctly like a Breath of the Wild style divine beast. It's that perfect marriage of ideas. While limiting the amount that you can freely explore might seem like a step backwards compared to Medoh and Rudania, I think having 2 divine beasts with somewhat more linear progression styles and 2 that offer more freedom is not a bad idea. It's all about balance. Rudania and Medoh put flexible traversal on the forefront, having you change the layouts of the dungeon to suit your need, and letting you move about almost the entire dungeon as soon as you get the map. This makes for some super fun gameplay, but it also means that the puzzles can't be as in-depth, and can just as often be completely circumvented with a bit of out-of-the-box thinking. So while that manipulation gimmick gets tied into the puzzles of the dungeon decently well, it also feels far more important to the traversal. And all of these puzzles feel like they're based on the physics, rather than any core mechanic unique to this dungeon itself. For Ruta and Naboris, that's simply not the case. Puzzle solving is at the forefront here, and the amount of layout that you can change is far more limited, so that manipulation gimmick has great impact on individual puzzles rather than traversal itself. Is one style better than the other? Not necessarily. I've stated this in previous videos, but it all comes down to execution. Variety and balance is also always good, though in my opinion Ruta falls just slightly short in terms of that execution. Naboris does not. Part of that is by virtue of separating its rooms better than Ruta did, since most of Ruta really is just one large room when you think about it. Having this separation means the puzzles in each individual room, while still maintaining that interconnectivity, can be more in-depth, and the developers are forced to have that manipulation gimmick matter more to the puzzles here, and for Naboris, they pulled it off wonderfully. As far as the architecture goes, there isn't too much to say that I haven't already while talking about the other divine beasts. Naboris is an ancient Sheikah construct, just like the rest, this time modeled after a giant camel, with the spires on the top floor making up the humps on the camel's back. Taking a look at creating a champion, it seems that this was the first design they really committed to. Page 207 states that among the early design proposals, the camel made a big impression. The direction of the design of all the other divine beasts was dictated by the polished version of the initial camel. Indeed, looking at the concept art they have in the book here, while many of the other divine beasts went through massive revisions, it seems that Naboris retained its overall visual identity and design right from the start of development all the way to the finished product. I don't know if this is intentional or not then, but the design of Naboris, having these two round spires at the top, also parallels its resting place atop Spectacle Rock, which is a natural land formation and recurring landmark throughout the series. So we have a minor visual parallel here, which could be what inspired the Sheikah architects to design Naboris this way in the first place. After all, I really can't think of any camels appearing in any Zelda game, including Breath of the Wild. We don't even know if the creature exists within the world of Hyrule or not, but I could be way off base here and overthinking things. As for where Naboris was excavated from, this is the one divine beast we have the most information about in this regard. We even get a flashback cutscene early on in the game showing this. Naboris was discovered somewhere in the Hyrule Canyon, and the scaffolding that was used for this digging operation is still around in the present day, even 100 years later. It's worth noting that when Calamity Ganon resurfaced, the champions were accompanying Princess Zelda to Mount Lanayru. To be more specific, they were at the east gate of the Lanayru Promenade when all hell broke loose. This put Urbosa, warrior queen and champion tasked with piloting this divine beast, at a severe disadvantage, since she would have the longest travel distance to make it back to her divine beast. Well, arguably Revali actually had farther to go, however he was able to fly over most obstacles and head in almost a straight line directly to his divine beast. Urbosa would have to travel through the promenade, cross central Hyrule, snake around the Great Plateau and through Gerudo Canyon to make it all the way back to Naboris. With her in such a rush, she may have already been exhausted by the time she made it back, making it even easier for the already quick Thunderblight Ganon to get the best of her. It's likely she didn't have the Thunder Helm on her person at the time of the battle either, since I assume it would have been kept in Gerudo Town for safekeeping, and according to the Champion's Path map in Creating a Champion, she didn't make the detour back to town, but went straight for the Divine Beast. With Thunderblight already being such a fast adversary, the sheer exhaustion, which would slow her reaction time, and Urbosa not having the one item that would grant her resistance to his element of choice, it is understandable, albeit quite tragic, that Urbosa would meet her end here, despite her being more than competent as a warrior. The music of Naboris is among my favorite of the bunch. It's a serious highlight of this game's soundtrack. The song begins pretty well how you'd expect it to. As is the case with all the Divine Beast themes, the track opens with an eerie, ambient piece, with droning, heavy piano chords. And I've talked it to death at this point, so I won't dwell on it. All I'll say on the matter is that yes, the Morse code signals are present in this track, just like the other ones, kicking in almost immediately here. Once you have the map and at least one terminal activated, the track really kicks into gear, with some string instruments, maybe an Arabic oud, though I'm not totally sure on that one, and a more laid-back piano progression. There's just this air about this piece, a certain optimism and ethereal feeling carried in the song's reverb. The instrumentation feels like it pairs really nicely with the theme for Gerudo Town, or even the theme for Urbosa herself, as if the Gerudo chief's personality is injected directly into the music here. Cool, collected, and hopeful, but with no shortage of skill. At the same time, the beeps and static electric tones underlie the entire track, so we have a clash here of the Gerudo desert-dwelling culture and the Sheikah's technological prowess. These two elements musically at odds with each other. It's wonderfully written. Once all terminals are activated, the track picks up in pace. The strumming of the oud and the vocalizations are both intensified. This track is mostly the same as before, but there are some new phrases that sound like they're almost ripped right out of Gerudo Town's theme. It's not just a nice pairing, it's a direct quote, tying this theme to not just Urbosa, but now Riju as well. As you'd expect, there's also a great sense of anticipation in this track, but it's not quite as fast-paced as, say, Rudania or Medoh's final themes, nor is it as somber as Ruta's, instead striking a nice, optimistic balance. Alright, let's have a look at the progression in detail. We'll enter from this boarding platform, suspended below the belly of the beast. There's a Guardian Scout to fight right off the bat here, and some Malice to clear out of the way. Following the ramp, we'll find ourselves in the dungeon's central chamber. Across the room and up this ramp, we'll find the small room containing the Guidance Stone, granting us the map. As usual, from here we have the objective of activating 5 terminals, which are spread out throughout the Divine Beast. As I mentioned earlier, this dungeon has the most linear progression structure of the 4 Divine Beasts, but there is still some flexibility offered here, so keep in mind that I'll be covering things in the order that just makes the most sense to me in terms of how and where we'll come across them. Terminal number 1 is right here inside this central room, but it's upside down. Simply rotate the correct one of these 3 cylinders and you'll be able to reach and activate it. Terminal number 2 is also in this central room, but hidden inside this enclosure. You'll want to destroy these bombable walls blocking these balconies, make your way to this one, and then rotate the appropriate cylinder so that the enclosure with the terminal lines up with the opening in the wall here. Then climb inside and rotate again so that the terminal is upright and able to be activated. Easy. Side note, but these balconies off the central room have a handful of optional treasure chests as well as a couple of Guardian Scouts to battle. There's also an optional chest tucked inside the cylindrical hallway that extends up Naboris' neck, the gate for which can be opened by completing the circuit along these 3 main cylinders. A few more optional chests are hidden among the platforms in the central room as well, which can be reached with some tricky manipulation of those cylinders. So feel free to collect the goodies that'll be most helpful to you, whether it be guardian weapons, a bow, or some bomb arrows. Though one of these optional treasure chests is tucked on this butt platform back here, suspended from a rope. For whatever reason, I just always have a hard time grabbing this chest, so if it plummets down off the Divine Beast and you miss out, you're not alone. Alright, we'll find terminal number 3 inside of Naboris' head. Make sure that the circuit is completed in the main room. We'll need to climb out of the central chamber to this platform and solve this puzzle by turning this crank, which will rotate these gears on the side of the platform. Again, completing the circuit, the head should raise and this elevator will activate. Catching a ride takes us right up to the terminal. 3 down, 2 to go. The final pair of terminals are hidden within the spires on Naboris' back. From here though, there's Malice blocking the way into those spires, so let's cross back through the central room and head out the path on the opposite end instead. Again, make sure that the circuit is aligned on the ceiling of the central room and connected to this circuit puzzle. Move these metal blocks to complete the circuit, and this platform will rotate, raising this ramp up to the first spire. At the top floor of Spire 1 is another crank, which should rotate the circuit on the middle level, activating the moving platform that connects the 2 spires together, allowing you to freely move between them. Before we head that way though, make sure to grab this orb from this ledge on the bottom floor of the spire. Bring the orb and cross over to Spire number 2. We can clear some Malice and we'll find terminal number 4 right here out in the open, so we can activate that before moving on. Next, ride the elevator to the top floor of Spire 2 and grab this second orb. Bringing both orbs downstairs, we can power this gate to open it, battle these 2 Guardian Scouts, and then place the 2 orbs on their pedestals, which will open this gate, granting us access to the final terminal. Well done. All that's left is to activate the central control unit, which is back downstairs in the central room. Just make sure you rotate these cylinders so that it's oriented the correct way and not upside down or something. And just as you'd expect, when we attempt to activate it, we'll be confronted by the dungeon boss. Here we go. Malice will flood out from the central control unit, forming the Scourge of Divine Beast Vah Naboris. This is Thunderblight Ganon, widely regarded as the hardest boss in the game. It's no coincidence that he also happens to be my favorite of the 4 blights. From a visual standpoint, Thunderblight's design is a lot less intimidating than the rest. He still retains the overall visual identity of being a horribly spliced together monstrosity of Sheikah Tech and Malice, but he's also just a small boy. He's about the same size as Link, who isn't exactly known for his height to begin with, but that puts him at a serious size disparity compared to the rest of the blights. While you never see them together in this game, the scenes in Age of Calamity that show the 4 blights side by side makes this difference in size even more noticeable. That said, he's not unintimidating per se, just doesn't have the same visual impact or seem as threatening as the rest. But maybe Zelda games have just conditioned me to think that bosses should be gigantic. Who knows? From a gameplay standpoint, this is where Thunderblight shines. His size may make him less intimidating at a glance, but it affords him a speed that the rest simply can't match up to. Thunderblight is fast, and he will use his speed to his advantage. He also happens to be the only blight with a proper shield, meaning that attacking him head-on isn't the answer. You can temporarily break his shield, sure, but this will come at the cost of that precious weapon durability. So here's what I recommend. Learn his attack pattern and get good at either flurry rushes or shield parries. When Thunderblight uses this zigzagging dash attack, it is a double-edged sword for him, so to speak. It's his chance to strike at you, but it is also when he lowers his guard, so keep him targeted, and when he's about halfway through his dash, either backflip or shield bash. And the timing should line up perfectly for either a flurry rush or parry respectively. Through all the times I've fought Thunderblight, this is what I found to be the most reliable way to take him down. But I will grant you that it isn't easy to master. So you know, Daruk's Protection and Stasis Plus are always options for you if you can't get the hang of it. There is, of course, a second phase to the battle, which feels a bit more like it has a defined attack pattern. He'll summon these metal pillars and drop them around the arena. Then he'll charge lightning, which will strike at each pillar. Use Magnesis to grab one and draw it to him, turning his attack against him. him. This will not only deal a fair amount of damage, but it will also ground him and open him up to attack. Between that and continuing with the method I mentioned for the first phase of the battle, you should be able to take Thunderblight Ganon on. I mentioned it already, but I'll say it again. This is my favorite of the 4 blights. After the ease of which the other blights can be obliterated, it's frankly refreshing to have one of them really put up a fight like this. This is the only blight that I have a hard time using my bow to hit stun, since he'll use his shield to guard against that attack. Thunderblight is the only one where I have to really wait for an opening in his defenses to attack, rather than just hitting him with everything that I've got, even for the first phase of the battle. In other words, Thunderblight's use of speed and his overall aggression means that he puts you on the defensive rather than the offensive. Not saying that one is better than the other necessarily, but Thunderblight is definitely the hardest boss fight to master. Personally, I always find that capping a dungeon off with a boss fight that is actually challenging is far more rewarding. And given that this is the hardest dungeon of the 4 divine beasts, making this one the toughest boss makes a lot of sense to me. I love it. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll be able to activate the central control unit. Urbosa's spirit will appear and reward us with the final champion ability, Urbosa's Fury, which summons a lightning storm that deals massive damage to individuals and groups of enemies alike. It is a bit OP, but hey, after that boss fight, you've earned it. With the divine beast now back under the control of its rightful champion, it can take its position atop Spectacle Rock, taking aim and awaiting its moment for our impending battle against Calamity Ganon. So, that's the dungeon. Oh boy. If it wasn't obvious, Vah Naboris is my favorite divine beast. It has an interesting core mechanic that spills into all areas of the dungeon, and it feels like the only one with puzzles that actually challenge your brain. While the dungeon manipulation gimmick here doesn't lend itself to as flexible a feeling of traversal, it also doesn't really matter because of how fun and engaging everything else is. Besides, at least making your way around this central room in particular is pretty much as flexible as those other divine beasts. It just happens to be limited to this one room. But having this dungeon restrict access to certain areas until you complete puzzles and pushing us into that more linear progression style feels incredibly refreshing, since the rest of the game so strictly adheres to, well, not being strict. Having this huge central room that you manipulate and having the rest of the dungeon branch off from there, while having a core mechanic that impacts other parts of the dungeon, brings to mind for me places like the Water Temple, Snowhead, Great Bay Temple, Lakebed Temple, and even the Sand Ship. It's a formula that many of my favorite Zelda dungeons are made of. In fact, if it wasn't held back by the ubiquitous and redundant Sheikah construct aesthetic, I have no doubt that Naboris would be counted among the best of the best Zelda dungeons. Putting that visual and architectural style aside, if we simply look at the core mechanics and the progression, while it may still be a bit short on enemy encounters, this is still a standout dungeon. So as I said, this is my favorite divine beast. While it may be the most challenging one in the game, I've never thought challenge was a bad thing. And let's be honest, it falls right in line with the difficulty of classic Zelda dungeons. It's a divine beast I always look forward to completing. After completing all 4 of the divine beasts, we'll be called back to the Shrine of Resurrection, where we first set out on our adventure. Here we'll receive the One-Hit Obliterator, an extremely powerful weapon that, well, can defeat any enemy in one hit. The drawback is that while using it, you can also be killed in a single hit. There's a series of 4 challenges with 4 additional shrines to complete using the One-Hit Obliterator. These can be pretty unforgiving, but they aren't unreasonably hard either. After finishing these 4 shrines, 4 new monuments will appear around Hyrule, one near each divine beast, which will each show the location of 3 new challenges, which all unlock new shrines. So combining this with the 4 on the Great Plateau, we have to complete 16 new shrines that weren't in the base game. The challenges outside of these shrines are a bit more interesting than the shrines themselves in my opinion, as they don't feel very distinct from the existing 120, but the one-hit obliterator challenge as well as the champion trials that exist outside of these shrines are pretty interesting and fun. They can range from defeating a hard boss to snowboarding through a series of rings under a time limit to having to sneak back through the Yiga hideout. These all culminate in a rematch with each of the blights, but in each case we're given a limited loadout of equipment, making these boss fights notably harder than the first time around. The reward for defeating each blight again is an upgrade to each of the corresponding champion abilities, significantly reducing their cooldown rates. We also get some pretty nice cutscenes that give some perspective into the champions' lives, which is nice to see. Overall, I have mixed feelings about this lead up to the DLC dungeon. There's a lot of varied and interesting things to do, but also a lot that feels like just more of the same. Going through more shrines and fighting bosses that we've already beaten, well, it can feel a bit stale. I do feel like the rewards provide enough incentive for me to still recommend it, but I also think that Nintendo could have done better with this. The new shrines really start to feel like they're blending in with the rest. It's a shame because when I stop to examine them individually, they are actually among some of the better shrines in the game, but even still, they just don't stand out because it's the same cookie cutter Sheikah aesthetic with the same shrine music and the same architecture. You get the point. Still, I enjoy these challenges. The Moldu King, this battle against a bunch of Guardian Skywatchers, and the little obstacle courses they take you through are all pretty fun and interesting, so it's a mixed bag. I do think 16 is a lot of shrines to get through though, and that gripe could have been mitigated if they all provided spirit orbs. See, by the end of the game, if you've completed all the shrines and divine beasts, you can have either maxed out hearts or stamina, but not both. Adding more shrines could have felt more justifiable if they also gave you the right amount of standard spirit orbs and allowed you to max out both stats. But aside from the first 4 during the one-hit obliterator challenge, they instead give you these divine beast emblems, which look just like spirit orbs, but aren't, leaving one of those stats still incomplete. It just feels like a missed opportunity to me, but alas, I'm getting sidetracked. So with those challenges, 16 shrines, and 4 boss fights out of the way, we can return to the Shrine of Resurrection again, which as it turns out also doubles as an elevator, taking us straight down into the dungeon. This is the final trial. As I mentioned before, people often refer to this place as the 5th divine beast, and it's easy to see why. The overall structure of this place looks and feels a lot like the divine beasts, and it clearly combines elements from all 4 of them. Even the map screen says Divine Beast Controls when referring to the dungeon manipulation gimmick, a trope that has been carried through each Divine Beast, but is notably absent from the base game's one non-Divine Beast dungeon, that being Hyrule Castle. We'll come back to this idea in a bit though. From a level design standpoint, this is still a bit varied from what the other 4 have done. The final trial is segmented into 5 unique sections. The central chamber where we'll find the map, and 4 cylindrical rooms that branch off from the central room, each with mechanics pulled right from the 4 divine beasts. Rotating cylinders and connecting a circuit, just like in Naboris, navigating a rotating walkway and bringing an orb back through a dedicated track, just like one of Rudania's core puzzles, navigating through the wind, not unlike what we have to do with the various updrafts aboard Medoh, and raising and lowering water levels, which actually Ruta never had us do that. But hey, this is still water themed, like Ruta was, so there's that. Overall, there is a sense of finality to this dungeon. Many classic final dungeons such as Ganon's Castle, Ganon's Tower, Skykeep, and even the Moon from Majora's Mask do this sort of recap in which ideas that were established in the game's various dungeons are revisited here in the final dungeon. So it is fitting that the 4 terminals are locked behind puzzles inspired by the 4 divine beasts. Not all the puzzles are one-to-one. That would be boring if it was exact repeats of what we've already completed. So rather than going for replicas, it's more like creating new, unique puzzles inspired by the themes present in their respective divine beasts. The overall structure and layout plays into Breath of the Wild's openness in a fairly balanced way as well. Fittingly, the 4 sections off of the main room, just like the 4 divine beasts themselves, can be completed in any order, though obviously there is a sort of implied order based on how easy it is to reach each section, but you're not forced to complete them in any specific sequence. Each section is like a small linear path in itself, with a specific puzzle to complete, so in a sense, these are 4 small linear sections that make up the components of one larger non-linear dungeon. Hope I'm still making sense. I like this balanced approach actually. I also appreciate that there is a good balance here between puzzles and combat. While each side room is pretty much exclusively puzzle focused, the main room has loads of enemies, more than each divine beast combined. They spawn in waves after activating each terminal and consist of uncorrupted guardian scouts, a guardian turret, and even skywatchers. From a combat perspective, this is the most challenging dungeon yet. The downside here is that the puzzles here don't quite feel so interesting. Like each of the 4 is only scratching the surface of their potential. None of them really push you to your limits or test your brain. Maybe it's because I'm going into this right after completing Naboris, which I love, but it just feels as though all of these puzzles are a little too on the simple side compared to what that divine beast had to offer. Perhaps this could have been mitigated by simply having each of the 4 sections expanded upon further instead of limiting them to what is essentially a single hallway with a single puzzle each. If they had taken the amount of floor plan added into some of those shrines and instead included them as part of this dungeon, then perhaps that could have alleviated this. I just feel like the meat of this DLC is the lead up to the dungeon when it could have been the dungeon itself. Fact is, this place just isn't very big. From an architectural standpoint, this one is a bit different. It still has the same Sheikah architecture as usual, but rather than roaming freely around Hyrule like the divine beasts, this dungeon is deep underground below the plateau. In that sense, it feels like this one is a combination of the shrines and the divine beasts, especially in how it ends with an ancient Sheikah monk, just like the shrines do. There's still a lot to make it feel like a divine beast though, and there's even some exposed cave walls and what appears to be some natural lighting, rather than the fully enclosed shrines which are lit completely artificially. The final trial is also the least organic feeling one yet. There are lots of large gears and mechanisms, and the overall shape of the dungeon is not based on an animal. Creating a champion even states that the divine beast concept was born out of the idea of making each dungeon sort of like a character in its own right, but that can't really be said for this place. It doesn't feel like a beast, but rather something more industrial. Now, I am no mechanic, but I've seen the idea put out there that the dungeon is based on a combustion engine. I personally know nothing about engines, but sure, with the cylinders here, I can see that. It makes sense, especially taken as foreshadowing for the Master Cycle being the reward here. A theory I've heard that ties directly into that idea is that the dungeon itself is the literal engine of the Master Cycle, and that it gets shrunk down when given to us as a rune ability. There's a lot to unpack with that theory, and while it sounds pretty cool, it just feels unlikely. The dungeon is tied too closely to the Shrine of Resurrection for that to feel right to me. As for my own belief on what exactly this place is, I would refer you to this video made by Monster Maze. I have spoken at length with Don and gotten his blessing to cite him on this, so I'll summarize what I feel is relevant to the theory here and expand on it with my own thoughts, but I would encourage you to please go watch his video on this dungeon if you haven't already. It is incredibly well made and goes into great detail about the true nature and purpose of this place. But the gist of what you need to know in context of this video is that this is a training facility. Creating a champion all but confirms as much with the very tiny mention of the final trial that exists within the book. This place is meant to synergize the champions, to train them to work together as a team of 5, the 4 Divine Beast pilots and the Hylian champion that wields the Master Sword. Of course, the Divine Beast pilots are all dead at this time, so Link is somewhat forced to complete this trial on his own, while his allies accompany him in spirit. Literally. This theory just makes a lot of sense, considering the segmented nature of the level design here, the idea being that each champion would complete their respective puzzles and activate a terminal, essentially training them in how to operate their own divine beasts, while the Hylian hero would train against the swarms of guardians in the central chamber, to prepare for close quarter combat against Ganon. Considering what their respective roles are, with the Divine Beast pilots being recruited as support, while the hero has to get close with the Master Sword and deal the final blow against Ganon, this brings a sense of context as to why the dungeon is structured the way that it is. It simply wouldn't make sense to have as interconnected a layout or puzzle design if these puzzles were meant to be completed by a team that splits up, rather than one person. Segmenting them just makes sense in that way. The downside is that I find it overall a little less fun and interesting, and a little more like doing a checklist. But I guess I can't fault them here for designing something that is different than the structures of the other Divine Beasts, especially with how often I say variety in dungeon design is a good thing. Something worth a quick mention is that the item pickups found in the various treasure chests are all equipment related to the various races of Hyrule, and just happen to be the exact materials used to craft the champion's weapons. Not that I've ever had to replace them, since I just hang them all up in my house. This does feed into this theory though, that this was meant to train and provide equipment for the champions themselves. The Shrine of Resurrection being attached to the facility makes sense too, since even though the enemies in this training facility are not corrupted or impacted by Ganon's influence, they can still inflict very real harm on the people meant to be training here. So having a medical facility on site, just in case, isn't a bad idea. The music here is a bit different. It's a new remix of the shrine music that builds and grows as we make progress. Of course, the music building upon itself is what all of the Divine Beast themes have done, but there is never a sense of tension or unease here. This actually makes sense though, since the final trial, like the shrines, are untouched by Ganon's influence, so the creepy, downright haunting vibes of the other Divine Beast themes simply wouldn't fit here. Aside from that, it is a more dramatic version of the shrine theme, and in my opinion, a better one, since the instrumentation feels a bit more dramatic and robust. The typical shrine theme serves its purpose well enough, even if it gets a bit repetitive after hearing it 136 times. But that theme has always felt a bit hollow and mysterious, which is by design, sure, it works for that. But for the final trial, they wanted something that swells and feels full, and this piece just nails that. Truthfully, I had to set aside some bias here while writing this. I've played this game a lot, start to finish probably 8 or 9 times, and I've heard the shrine theme a lot of times. So initially, I was ready to rag on this piece for being too samey, but giving it a good honest listen for this video, it is actually a pretty great piece of music taken on its own merits. The choir voices, strings, and percussion that were absent in the regular shrine theme really shine through here. It adds a lot to this piece. When it picks up in pace after activating all terminals, that simple increase in tempo makes the pre-boss anticipation feel really palpable. It's good stuff, and admittedly a piece I've never given enough credit to before now. Alright, let's go over the progression here real quick. There isn't exactly an entryway or foyer, so we'll be stepping into the central chamber as soon as we exit the elevator here. There is a lone guardian scout to swat aside, and in the middle of this room is the guidance stone, which gives us the map. Rather than the usual 5, there are only 4 terminals to activate, but as I mentioned before, they can be done in any order, so I'll of course cover them in what feels most logical to me based on how accessible each area of the map is and how we traverse this place. I'm also going to exclude mentioning each of the combat breaks here because it's just fighting a bunch of enemies between each terminal. Nothing too noteworthy. Terminal 1 can be found by heading up this ramp near the elevator on the west side of the room. We can unlock this chamber by using magnesis to connect the gears here, which will cause the cylinder to rotate continuously, much like in Naboris. Through some tricky use of magnesis here, and by changing the rotation direction, we can complete these axles and, by extension, the circuit puzzle in this room. This unlocks the gate at the far end of the chamber so that we can access and activate the terminal. Terminal number 2 is in the chamber directly opposite this one. We'll need to use these gears as a platform to reach the entryway, carefully navigate this spiky rotating walkway, then complete this little physics puzzle to get this orb out from this rotating track on the far wall. Then drop the orb in this little track so that it rolls into its slot, just like we did back on Rudania, and the enclosure with the terminal will open up. 2 down, 2 to go. To reach the last 2 terminals, we'll need to get to the second floor of the central chamber by once again climbing these gears. The third section can be reached by using stasis to complete this puzzle, which pulls up this platform, which sort of combines these 2 puzzles from Vah Ruta. Use Cryonis to push this button and get the platform rotating. Ride up to the walkway, use stasis to smack a faucet, lowering the water level, then use a metal ball to raise the water back up, and then using Cryonis, we can reach terminal number 3. The 4th side chamber can be reached by, again, connecting the gears so that this entryway rotates continuously. There's a large fan in this room, and by changing the direction that it spins, we can influence the wind direction. We'll want to use the paraglider with the wind at our backs to reach these platforms, then use stasis so that the fan doesn't shred you, and glide over to the final terminal. Once all terminals are activated, the great door at the far end of the central chamber will unlock, so we just need to connect the central gear to it to open it up, revealing the Sheikah monk whose voice we've been hearing throughout this questline, Monk Maz Koshia. We can approach him as we usually do with the other monks, but instead of granting us a spirit orb, he has one final test for us. And heck, he moves! He'll teleport us away so that we can begin the boss fight. We'll find ourselves being warped to this massive arena floating over Hyrule, where we'll be confronted by the dungeon boss. It's Monk Maz Koshia himself, and this actually beats out Thunderblight as my favorite boss in the game. From a visual standpoint, he's nothing to write home about. He's a self-mummified Sheikah monk, just like the rest that we've seen throughout the adventure, but his combat style is the most diverse and interesting we've seen yet. There are also 3 distinct phases to the fight, unlike the usual 2. He attacks using a mix of ancient Sheikah tech, Yiga-like techniques with moves that reflect foot soldiers, blade masters, and even some of Koga's moves as well. He uses Thunderblight's dashing attack, and he can make duplicates of himself, grow to an enormous size, and shoot lasers out of his face. He wields the Phrenic bow and a variety of elemental arrows and a guardian sword plus, and he uses all of these to great effect. This guy is tough as nails, but it never feels quite as punishing as Thunderblight. The sheer scope and variety of this boss fight is frankly unparalleled and makes it super fun to do. It's too bad because you can actually go and do infinite repeats of the Blight battles, but you can't challenge Maz Koshia to a rematch once he's defeated. Missed opportunity there. Alright, let's break down those distinct phases. The first part of the battle is rightfully the most straightforward. He'll rush you with his sword or use his bow to attack you. It's a one-on-one duel with him essentially matching Link's own natural abilities. When he uses the Thunderblight dash, the timing is actually a bit different here, making it a little more difficult to consistently parry or perfect dodge, but it is still doable. When he uses this attack to cause an updraft, it also gives you a perfect opening to use your bow and unleash a flurry of arrows. Otherwise, it's basically careful 1v1 sword combat, which I kinda love. The second phase of the battle kicks in once about a third of his health is down. It's pretty similar to the first phase, with the distinction being that he now starts making those aforementioned duplicates of himself. All the duplicates have the same moveset as him, so you could be trying to dodge one while another rushes at you with their sword and another tries to snipe you with his Phrenic bow. Urbosa's Fury in particular is a pretty useful ability for crowd control here, if you can find the time to charge it up properly, since it'll disperse the duplicates, leaving only the real Maz Koshia behind and vulnerable to attack. Otherwise, I haven't really found a reliable way to distinguish the duplicates from the real one. They all look and behave the same, making this a pretty tough part of the fight if you aren't good with taking on multiple enemies at once. The good news is that the duplicates can all be dispatched with a single strike, so it may at times be a matter of simply weeding through the crowd until you manage to hit the real one. That third and final phase kicks in once he's down to about half his health. At this point, there's no hiding among clones. Instead, he grows to an enormous size, tries to shoot lasers at you, stomp on you, launch these spike balls, and more. He'll still call in the duplicates, but at this point, since they're so easily distinguishable from the real thing, they're more of a nuisance than anything. As far as taking him down goes, he's open to attack at all times. He isn't wearing armor or anything, so you can continuously strike him to chip away slowly at his health. But the best thing you can do is go for headshots to get that bonus damage, or wait for a chance to successfully parry a laser beam, which will deal a significant chunk of damage as well as stun him, temporarily leaving him vulnerable. This may all sound easy in theory, but his attack pattern is truly unpredictable, and the man has a lot of HP. This is by no means a short fight either, but I love it so much. To be honest, it's kind of refreshing overall. I mean, the 4 blights are fine, but they start feeling really samey despite their difference in attack patterns. By contrast, Monk Maz Koshia is such a breath of fresh air. It's a fun and exhilarating fight all around that truly tests your combat skills. I would be remiss if I didn't touch on the boss fight music here too. It is the best combat theme in the game. It's unreasonably good. It includes the usual trappings of piano, contrasted with synth, some string elements sprinkled throughout, and there is something about that main beat that is just so good. It perfectly embodies the atmosphere of this battle. It remains tense without making the old monk feel evil. I love it. Once the fight is complete, Maz Koshia will yield, stating that you've completed his test, proclaiming you the true hero. With all doubt erased from his mind, he grants you access to the true 5th Divine Beast, a vehicle fit for our hero, the Master Cycle Zero. Yes, a freaking motorcycle. God, I love this game. So that's the dungeon. After this, we get a bit of exposition with Cass, another memory cutscene with the champions at Hyrule Castle, and we get this nice photo as a memento. What a lovely end to this DLC campaign. So overall, I have some mixed feelings about the final trial. From a lore standpoint, the implications are pretty cool. The music is great, and that boss fight is honestly top tier. However, looking at it from a level design standpoint, it is sort of underwhelming. It feels redundant with its its use of architecture, the puzzles are creative but all rather short and simple, and the enemies are all ones that we fought numerous times before. I get what they were going for, and in many ways, it does remind me of the ground floor of Ganon's Tower in Wind Waker, which also had a central room with 4 branching areas that revisit mechanics from previous dungeons. But that feels more forgivable in my eyes because it was only the first third of that dungeon, not the entirety of it. Ganon's Castle in Ocarina of Time did the same thing with its first half, just with more segments. But again, that was only the first half. So do I think this dungeon is bad? No, but I just think it's a bit underwhelming for how segmented and simple it all is. The fact that Naboris, one of the previous divine beasts, which is mandatory to do before we can even do any of the DLC, is more interesting and challenging is kind of a shame. This feels like it was their opportunity to really reel us back in with something new, but instead they fell back on just making more of the same. But man, that boss fight is so good that it actually makes up for it. The fight against Maz Koshia is my favorite boss in the game, just for how varied and unpredictable his moves are, and how fun he is to take on. So it's a mixed bag. Simple, uninspired dungeon layout, easy puzzles, but an amazing boss battle. Couple that with all the rewards that you get along the way for this questline, including upgrades to your champion abilities and of course the master cycle, and overall you have a solid DLC pack that is still very much worth doing, even just for that boss fight alone. Hello friends, welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. For this series we have already completed all 4 of the Divine Beasts, as well as the final trial with Monk Maz Koshia. In fact, we have only 1 dungeon left to complete in all of 3D Zelda, until May 12th that is. So before anybody asks, yes, we will be going back to the 2D games after this, but today's focus will be on Breath of the Wild's finale, Hyrule Castle itself. I'm very grateful to have Triforce Trends joining me today as we take a deep dive into level design.
Hey guys, hope you're all having a great day and I hope you enjoyed this video today. Make sure to check my channel out after this video because it's a great video, please watch.
Make sure to go check the link in the description so that you can head over to his channel once you're done watching here. But otherwise, let's hop right into it.
As far as story stuff to do before the dungeon goes, it's a mixed bag. It all really is up to you to determine how much of that you're going to do. We like to go do as much as possible outside of the castle, including the Divine Beasts and the DLC stuff, but you don't have to. This is a game in which nearly nothing is mandatory.
Well, nothing other than the Great Plateau. Once you've finished the tutorial there and gotten the paraglider, there is nothing stopping you from heading straight over to Hyrule Castle, except for maybe your own survival skills. You don't even have to approach from the main entrance. You could bomb impact launch your way over, or swim the moat, or blast in through the front gates. The choice really is yours. It is, in my view, worth doing all of this extra stuff first to get the most out of the game, but you absolutely don't have to. And some players like to challenge themselves and just dive right in. So anyways, the TLDR here is that aside from the plateau, there isn't a story quest or companion character to meet or anything like that. The only pre-dungeon stuff that you have to do here after the plateau is travel to the castle itself. That's just the nature of the game. So with that out of the way, for our final time in Breath of the Wild, let's head into the dungeon. Welcome back to Hyrule Castle, a location that we have visited many times throughout the series, but this is the biggest and most expansive version of the iconic castle to date. It is also in many ways a true realization of how Breath of the Wild's open-air gameplay style could work in a dungeon, and it is great. This is in large part due to the enormous open-air floor plan and non-linear progression style.
Essentially, the designers have given us a huge playground to run around in and do as much or as little as we want. Most of the dungeon is entirely optional or can be skipped in several ways, allowing the player to choose how much of the content here they want to engage with. Whether that be finding Koroks, oh, so many Koroks, loot treasure chests and resources, collecting weapons, or battling the swathes of enemies here.
Oh, did you say enemies? Because, yeah, there are tons of enemies, including guardians, moblins, Lizalfos, and even a couple of Lynels and boss enemies. My biggest complaint through and through when looking at the divine beasts is how few enemies there have been within the dungeons themselves. But here in the castle, we have the highest concentration of baddies around, which makes the castle feel like it's actually dangerous to explore, which is a good thing, by the way. Thankfully, there are lots of weapons to find, some of the best in the game in fact, so there won't be any shortage of equipment to use when taking on these monsters. Not just weapons either, there's a robust selection of materials to find here, enough to make a meal for just about every status effect or buff, allowing you to use food and elixirs to bolster your odds of survival or just give yourself a bit of an edge in combat.
Now before we get ahead of ourselves though, let's pivot things and look at the architecture for a moment. Hyrule Castle is a pretty old building, made with pre-Calamity Hylian stone masonry, the same as you'd find at places like the Great Bridge of Hylia and the Outer Wall of the Great Plateau, all places with significance to the history of Hyrule.
At a glance, it may feel reminiscent of the Twilight Princess version of Hyrule Castle, but once you start looking at the finer details, that sense of similarity starts to fall apart pretty quickly, and I don't just say that because the castle is in such disrepair. This version of the castle feels a little more modest, less ornate than Twilight Princess's. That isn't to say that it has no ornamental features, it is the home of the royal family after all, and as you'd expect, the Hylian royal crest is plastered just about everywhere. But Twilight Princess's version of the castle had a lot of fancy ornamental gates, wall patterns, gold flourishes, and decorative panels. In general, it always felt to me that that game leaned more towards the Gothic style of architecture.
This version of the castle foregoes a lot of that for the more straightforward Romanesque medieval architectural type, with plenty of plain, exposed stone brick, which is actually quite a fitting look. It's ironic because this game is tens of thousands of years down the timeline after Twilight Princess, but it feels far less modern in comparison, but maybe this design choice was to more heavily contrast the technologically advanced, chicer architecture.
Regardless, the castle is a clean break from the final trial and divine beasts, which combined with the shrines gets pretty redundant feeling pretty fast. So a final dungeon that ditches all of that is a breath of fresh air. Well, mostly ditches, that is. There is actually still a shrine inside the castle itself, but that's more of a convenience for fast travel than anything else. In some senses, the castle feels like a counterpart to the Great Plateau, which was also an isolated playground. The plateau and castle in many ways both feel like condensed, heavily concentrated versions of the game map. The former being meant to stay engaging while easing new players into the game, the latter being meant to pose a challenge to players at the end of their journeys, whenever that may be. This is even backed up by the comparison to the Shrine of Resurrection and the Castle Sanctum made in the book Creating a Champion, which both feature the same coiling Sheikah technology and themes of revival, both being places where opposing forces, Link and Ganon, slumber and find themselves with a second lease on life, even if Ganon's way of doing it seems a lot nastier. Ugh.
There's plenty to discover here for the lore enthusiast as well, including 2 of Zelda's journals, as well as a journal belonging to the late King Rome. Regardless of which ones you're reading, they all manage to carry a sense of tragedy and pack a real emotional punch.
Okay, let's have a look at the music here. There are 2 distinct interior and exterior themes, which blend together and overlap depending on where you are in the castle. They are counterparts, 2 halves of the same piece, so they end up melding nicely while still retaining gaining their own distinct identities.
The exterior theme is robust, grandiose, and in many ways just as triumphant as it is tragic. The layers of piano here, the brass, the whole orchestra is brilliant. Some sections of this track feel lifted right out of the main Zelda series theme as well, and it's never sounded better. This theme is a bombastic, climactic piece that is the perfect accompaniment to our assault on the castle and approach up towards the final battle. Integrated into this half of the theme is also some bars taken straight from Ganon's theme, which is suitable considering this is where the King of Evil has been holed up for the last century.
By contrast, the interior theme is more hopeless. It ditches the brass for an organ, and the percussion falls out almost entirely. Ganon's theme is still integrated into the piece here, but alongside it is Zelda's Lullaby, the piece we know and love that has long served as the theme for the titular Princess of Hyrule. These two themes at odds with each other perfectly represent the struggle that has taken place here for the last century, with Ganon and Zelda keeping each other at bay for 100 years straight. A couple of really great details is the inclusion of the low health indicator from A Link to the Past, thank you GameSpot, and the sprinkling in of a few chimes that make up a portion of the main Zelda series theme once again. It's barely audible over the rest of the instrumentation here, but it's great to hear it included.
Between these two themes we have a pretty complex blend of emotions conveyed here. Ruin, desolation, hope, and triumph. Like the whole world is against you, but you just won't be stopped. It's musical perfection, and the choice to give us the two distant renditions of the theme is a perfect reflection of the open nature of this place.
It's not all open though. They strike a great balance in that regard. It's not like we're walking around a big empty field after all. It's more just open in the sense that we can determine where and how we explore the dungeon. That said, there are still several one-way paths blocked by malice with eyeballs, some of which can be circumvented with some clever climbing or use of Rivali's Gale, some of which cannot. There are long branching corridors, large rooms, and overall just lots of interconnectivity in the floor plan. So let's take a look at the progression structure here. Truly though, the best part of this dungeon is the amount of different paths and routes you can take through it. I don't think there's been a single playthrough of mine in which my progression through the castle has been the same.
If you want to head directly to the end goal, the Sanctum, you can take the outside path which winds up around the exterior of the castle, crossing through the two gatehouses and straight up to Ganon. Otherwise, you can bypass that and swim your way up instead, ascending the series of waterfalls using the Zora armor, or cheese all of that with Rivali's Gale, or you can explore inside and any combination or mix of these things.
Because of Breath of the Wild's open nature, they placed several entrances to the castle sprinkled around each side of the perimeter, so no matter which direction you're approaching from, you can find your way inside, whether it be through the east or west passages, the docks at the back of the castle, the front gates, some literal hole in the wall, or otherwise.
Unfortunately, some sections are really easily missed, such as the East Passage, which can only be entered from the outside via this one tunnel, whereas places like the Lockup, West Passage, the library and more all have multiple entrances and exits. I don't mind having a little bit of each, but it would be nice for this one entryway to not be so tucked out of the way and be easier to find. But considering it's an entirely optional section of the dungeon, that does feel pretty forgivable, let's be honest.
As mentioned before, there's a couple of overworld boss enemies here that could be seen as the dungeon mid-bosses. A stone talus hides in East Passage, a Stalnox serves as a test of strength in the lockup, and 2 Lionels, one in each gatehouse, guard the main path up to the sanctum. In terms of overall progression, I admit that I've struggled a bit with this script more than any of the previous 40 some odd dungeons that I've talked about in this series, simply due to just how open it is. There aren't any mandatory minor objectives to complete before the boss. There are no terminals to activate or keys you need to collect. Everything is optional. It's up to you to engage with what's here or simply ignore it. I personally like to go to the lockup as early as possible, fight my way through the cells, take on that Stalnox, and get what could be seen as the dungeon item, the legendary Hylian shield, which is by far the best shield in the game. Ooh, and I even got a good one this time.
Even then, the lockup can be approached from this rear entrance, entered through this hole in the wall, through West Passage, or by heading down this large vertical shaft into the adjoining hallway. There's no right or wrong way to go about it. There's also the armory, which has its own independent door, or you can head through the front gate and down these stairs. Zelda's room and study, meanwhile, have no interior path connecting to them, having all been sealed off by rubble, meaning that they have to be approached from outside. And look at that, there's almost a limitless amount of ways to do that thanks to the paraglider.
These same concepts apply to the library and dining room as well, which are all bursting with equipment and weapons and filled with enemies. So in terms of progression, it's hard for me to make a dedicated segment for this video because it's so wildly flexible. There is no one sequence of events or strict progression structure. However, that is the best part of it all. All of this stuff is worth exploring. It's challenging, fun, engaging, and rewarding to do. If dungeons are to appear in Tears of the Kingdom, then the castle here does set a precedent for how well the open-air gameplay style can absolutely work. One minor note is the difficulty balancing. As mentioned already, since you can choose to ignore most of the dungeon, and by extension most of the game itself, the developers had to find a way to incentivize you to actually explore. This is achieved in a couple of ways. One is the aforementioned materials and weapons scattered all throughout the castle. Since you're approaching the game's climax and the main route up to the sanctum is guarded heavily by guardians and tough enemies, placing these strongest weapons and gear around the castle means that you will want to explore to simply prepare yourself for the final stretch, especially if you chose to not do the divine beasts. But more on that in a moment.
And yes, even though those guardians are able to be bypassed, the game doesn't make it easy on you. So even if you can avoid fighting them, that doesn't mean you won't be in their crosshairs while making your approach to the sanctum. In short, it's hard to ignore these enemies when lasers are flying past you left and right.
Regardless of how much or how little you do, the end goal is the same. The castle sanctum at the very top of the structure. And when we step inside, we'll be confronted by the dungeon boss. In the sanctum here, there are 2 possible outcomes. If you've chosen not to complete the 4 divine beasts, you'll actually have to battle your way through a quick boss rush, taking on all 4 of the blights one after the other, or at least the blights of whichever divine beasts you haven't completed. So if you did 1 or 2, then the blights you missed will show up now. Taking on all 4 is actually pretty challenging, but beyond that, there isn't too much to say about the blights themselves that I haven't already covered in the other dungeon design videos for Breath of the Wild. So if you want to hear me rag on their boss design a bit, go check those out.
Otherwise, either once you've defeated them here, or if you've already beat them in the Divine Beast, then lasers will slice open this grotesque cocoon on the ceiling, and Calamity Ganon in all of his disgusting glory will drop out, break the floor, and take you to an area below ground. This arena is the Sheikah's Astral Observatory, and it shares some design parallels to the Sword Monk's chamber in Trial of the Sword, but it's here that we'll get to face down against this monstrosity.
Calamity Ganon is, from both a visual and gameplay standpoint, effectively a combination of all 4 blights, and like some kind of horrible nightmare spider, and also this one boss fight from Resident Evil 4, which is just too nasty to show on screen. So we're back to the horribly spliced together Sheikah tech and malice design. But credit where credit is due, this is the most horrifying and creepy rendition of this boss design yet. Maybe the scariest looking in the series. Well, until dehydrated zombie Ganon in Tears of the Kingdom maybe. He nasty, that's my point. Gameplay wise, the same concept applies. He has Fire Blight's sword, shield, and fire attacks, Water Blight's spear, Wind Blight's cannon and tornadoes, and Thunder Blight's annoying ability to summon these metal pillars and call down electricity. He also has a knack for clinging to the walls out of reach to avoid being attacked directly. That said, he shares too all of the Blight's weaknesses, so if you've found an exploit for one of them, even if it's just parrying those laser shots, then you'll be able to apply that tactic here and break through his defenses just as easily. In fact, you can parry any of his attacks. Any of them. And the champion abilities will provide you even further of an edge up on him. Not to mention that the divine beasts will strike at the onset of the battle and reduce his health all the way down to halfway.
Don't worry about running short on equipment here either, since there's actually a handful of weapons, arrows, and shields scattered around the perimeter of the room. Essentially, despite the fact that they designed the hardest and most nightmarish field boss in the game, if you've prepared and done the bulk of the main story, then Link is so OP that poor Calamity Ganon just doesn't stand a chance.
Regardless, I do actually like this battle. It doesn't hit the same level of awesomeness that Monk Mask Koshia does, but I like that it combines elements that the previous fights have taught us, and brings it all to a climactic head here. I just wish it were a little more difficult, but I suppose that if it were more difficult, then those straight to Ganon runs would be even harder than they already are. So by adjusting the difficulty, you'd end up impacting one of those experiences negatively.
Once you've chipped his health away, he'll burst at the seams and explode. You'll be teleported outside to Hyrule Field, and the masses of his malice will attempt to form a new body, born out of his refusal to give up. Now we have the true final battle. Or I guess until the next game anyway. Dark Vs Ganon. True to his name, visually he takes on the more boar-like appearance that we've come to expect, but made entirely of malice. He's massive as well, making this quite the spectacle. The only issue is, this fight is a cakewalk.
It's all spectacle and no challenge. I guess after the heavy action of Hyrule Castle and Calamity Ganon himself, a bit of a reprieve that remains climactic in tone isn't uncalled for, but it does feel like a bit of a letdown. You get the very powerful bow of light from Zelda, and you just shoot the glowing parts from horseback, and then in a boss fight trope that I have expressed massive distaste for, you shoot the big eyeball.
I suppose it makes some amount of sense that this is so easy. With Tears of the Kingdom on the horizon, we now know that this isn't the true enemy, but a puppet of Ganondorf's, or so it seems at least. Still though, games should be taken on their own merits, not depend on the context of an upcoming sequel, and for a game as vast and as robust as this, we all anticipated a truly climactic fight. Instead we got light arrow roast ham target practice, like jeez, the Gerudo horseback archery range is actually harder than this.
Just a quick side note, even if the boss fight itself was a letdown, the music here is kind of incredible. The deep piano chords set this incredible tension, and then the game's main theme, which has actually been absent throughout our adventure, finally kicks in here in a brilliant and upbeat rendition. I love the clashing vibes here between Ganon's theme with its heavy piano and the boldness of the strings which clamber over each other. Despite this being Dark Beast Ganon, the music is oddly uplifting, like we've already won, which fits since this fight is so easy, you really can't lose.
There's also a second version of the song which kicks in after the halfway point of the fight. It's pretty similar, but the tempo is amped up and a choir and brass section subtly joins in, with the prevalence of Ganon themes reduced even further down, which sort of musically signals that we have the upper hand here.
A third piece starts right when we're about to deal the final blow, and I don't care for it as much, but it's there for that last moment of tension, and it gets the job done well enough, especially for how brief it is. With Ganon defeated, we get our ending cutscene, with the king and champion spirits finally able to rest, and Zelda somehow didn't age. Then the credits roll, and our adventure finally comes to a close. Beautiful. So, that's the dungeon. Overall, despite the disappointment of a final boss, Hyrule Castle is a standout final dungeon. It has just the right tone, the right build-up, and feels like the best and truest realization of how a non-linear open-air dungeon can play out.
This is truly a great example for the sequel to follow, and when compared to the 4 Divine Beasts and the final trial, this is leagues ahead of those dungeons. While its progression structure, or rather lack thereof, is harder to nail down, the sheer concentration of challenge coupled with its limitless flexibility is exactly what makes this such a great dungeon. Compare this to the final trial in particular, which was way smaller and essentially a handful of segmented linear areas. This, by contrast, feels like a far more developed and satisfying conclusion to the game.
There's tons of secrets and collectibles to find, loads of weapons and equipment to nab, and swaths of enemies to battle, so my fellow completionists will find plenty of engaging things to do here. For those not as keen on being so thorough, that's okay too, because you don't have to do any of that. You can choose just how much to interact with while making your way to the finale. Options, my friends. Options are always good, and this sort of flexible progression means that no matter your playstyle, you'll find something to love here. And while I do have some nitpicks, like East Passage being tucked a little too out of the way, or Dark Beast Ganon being a bit of a pushover, those end up feeling like such small issues compared to all of the great stuff going on here. This is a great depiction of one of this series' most iconic locations, and a worthy finale to my favorite game. Well friends, this is the end of dungeon design in Breath of the Wild. I hope you've enjoyed this 6-part series, and I sincerely hope I've done this game justice. Dungeon design in Zelda is not over yet though. We've now completed Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword. So this caps off the entirety of the current 3D catalog. I can't wait to dive into the dungeons of Tears of the Kingdom, but in the meantime, as per many people's requests, yes, the 2D games are next. So make sure to join me next time when we'll be tearing apart the dungeons of Zelda 1 on the NES. I also want to thank my special guest Triforce Trends for joining me on this video.
I hope you all enjoyed. It was really nice to be here. I love you. I love you, Captain Bergeson. I hope I can be here again, and thank you all for watching.
It's been great, dude. Be sure to check the link in the description so that you can head over to his channel, where you'll find loads of great Zelda content. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. I truly hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and their ATHDs, and all of the other folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You all are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.